You.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Yeah. Just a second. Are you seeing this?
Yes.
Okay. So this is people who went to the presentation before I did this presentation a few months, or a part of this presentation a few months back. So I also will be using it again. So Mattin was there, Gabriel was there. So you'll see a bunch of repeated things, but I go a bit further because by now, as you know, I finished, or at least finished the final, what is a candidate for final version of the text. So there's a bunch of other new stuff here that is also in dialogue with a lot of the things that ESTP have been doing for the past, I don't know, 1.5 years or something like that. I'm sure everybody who read the text will recognize that. Maybe it's kind of the most STP text that I did solo in a certain sense. And it's revisiting a lot of our themes. And of course, using our point of view to understand and to, in a certain sense, up to a point, criticize our friend here, Mattin's proposal of social dissonance that was published last year. So this is the basic gist of it. Well, thank you all for coming. We'll just start away, and then maybe I'll be finished in 1 hour, and then we can have a debate or a conversation. Okay. So this was the abstract that I sent to Cecile in the first time around. It still reflects much of what's in the text, in the final text. Mattin's social dissonance proposes a reversal regarding the relationship between the practice and the material of art. Instead of upholding art as a form of practice of which both the material and output are sensible forms, for which in Mattin's framework, the notion of noise is important. It takes the social circuits involved in creating the art as a material for intervention, becoming the content of art itself. This has an important precedent in the way both avant-garde improvisation and noise mobilize these sensible forms as a way to denaturalize the practical basis that gives rise to them. From this point of view, Mattin's intervention is a radicalization of this tradition. Within this process, the concept of social dissonance makes the work of one, making explicit the end result of such inversion as incorporating a presentation of forms of alienation that are immanent to these practices, and two, bridging these specific interventions into artistic practice with the social world at large, sustaining a political valence for these protocols. Okay, these two theses, at first, this was the original abstract that I sent a few months back. I was, of course, focusing much more on social dissonance as an aesthetic, artistic intervention than the final paper is doing. But you can recognize that the second aspect, bridging the specific interventions with the social world at large, is, of course, the central problem, I think, of the final paper. So in a certain sense, there is some change of focus there going on, but at the same time, the basic criticism of the idea of social dissonance that is in the paper is kept from that time. While Mattin's work focuses on the dissonant aspect of this intervention, and then there's a positive kind of outcome, this presentation will plead for the necessity of a social synthetic function that results from these forms of untethering of the circuits that compose our social worlds. Our wager is that the question of the social synthesis, as Alfred Sohn-Rethel has proposed, gives one more complete view of the transitivity between these aesthetic interventions and the social world at large. And this also, I think I have to, talk a little bit more about the fact that social dissonance is, of course, not just an aesthetic kind of intervention. In the final text, I said that it is a concept that pertains to our social life in general. There is social dissonance going on. That is something that Mattin is theorizing, that is akin to a form of cognitive dissonance, but it is cognitive dissonance in the socially determined sense and determined by the social placement of agents that are then come to see themselves as individuals, right? And so there is this concept, which is a descriptive concept, right, of social dissonance. There is also a procedure, a kind of critical concept that, in a certain sense, it is also, while there is social dissonance going on, social dissonance can be harnessed in order to bring about the consciousness or the self-consciousness of this non-identity between what we take to be our social role and what we are doing, right? So there is this the second kind of social dissonance, which is the critical purport of social dissonance. And there's a third kind of social dissonance, which is also the kind of twofold, which is the procedure, the static procedure of producing a certain form of discomfort within a certain enclosed space that is typically the art gallery or the music venue, the kinds of spaces that Mattin usually goes to in order to do that. And there's a specific work that is given by the end of the book, which is a score for producing the social dissonance, which has the title Social Dissonance. So you have like 3 or 4 different meanings for social dissonance. So the plan for the presentation is basically the same from a few months back. Rehearse some threads in Mattin's argument, particularly with an eye on the function of the 2 Sohn-Rethelian interventions, which is something that I take to be very important, and of course very important to what I'm trying to do with that. Make the case for the idea of social synthesis in Sohn-Rethel, which is by our account underdeveloped in Mattin's book. Of course, Mattin talks a lot about real abstraction. Basically, like almost anybody who's interested in Sohn-Rethel, like real abstraction is the big thing, but social synthesis is kind of a secondary thing. So I've lately been interested in putting forward the idea that a social synthesis may be more important than the real abstraction. The real abstraction is kind of secondary to the ways this social synthesis is operated. Then offer a passageway between Sohn-Rethel's social synthesis and Salarzan philosophy that might bridge both alienations from above and from below. This is underdeveloped in the final paper. This was part of the original presentation, but it is more present in the real abstraction in the given paper, which I used a few months back. That part I cut off today because I want to focus on what's new about this. And D, offer an alternative argument for the political valence of social dissonance from Mattin's that would demand and work through the social synthetic functions of what is being done. Of course, this was done in a certain way also a few months back, and now it's done in a certain different way, using some results of what STP has been doing, particularly the text working through political organizations, okay? So intro now, so I'll just present some threads of Mattin's argument now. So the book starts with this quote. Schoenberg says, all tones can be treated as equal. John Cage says, all sounds can be treated as equal. Next logical step, everyone can be treated as equal. Why is it that we can accept that all musical notes can be treated as equal, even that all sounds can be treated as equal, but find it extremely difficult to envisage the possibility of all people being treated as equal? So this is the beginning of the book. We live under an economic system that makes social equality impossible. One might object that these are different types of register. The first 2 are aesthetic, of course, while the last is socio-economic and political. However, today these registers are very much interrelated. So the kind of interrelation is an important issue for the book because, as I said, like there is a general argument of social political import and a specific practice that maybe it will be clear by the end of the presentation. It's not just an artistic practice, but it is a kind of practice that happens to happen inside artistic spaces. So I'm just kind of weakening the affirmation that this is just a kind of artistic thing. I don't think it is for Mattin. Mattin is here, can after discuss this with us. But it happens to happen within artistic spaces, and I think there's good reason for that in a certain sense, like because well, kind of the reason is the same reason where I think people who know me recently or last couple of years, I've been working also on the Harry Flint notion of constitutive dissociations. And one of the problems that was kind of interesting to me is that what Flint wanted was to bring about new forms of practice that are unconceptualized from the point of view of, the status quo, the way things are. But it is really difficult to do that without being determined or conceptualized as art, because art is the space where you can, in a certain sense, suspend the immediate practical goals of things that you're doing. So because of that, art is maybe the only place where this is kind of accepted and it's part of the world of art. So in a certain sense, if you try to do something like that, it will almost automatically be cast as being artistic, right? So there's this practical matter, which is a kind of contingent upon what specific type of reasoning is embedded in the specific practice. And I think Mattin suffers from that, not because of your fault, of course, but because of the way our social categories are determined. So the debate between humanism and anti-humanism has to do with whether to emphasize the subjective or the structural economic forms of determination at the level of totality. So there's this ongoing debate between humanism and anti-humanism within the book. But in the present day, these are intertwined insofar as the hegemonic ideological force is the neoliberal mantra that all subjects must enter into constant competition with one another. While real subsumption might not be total, it is true that through social media, the pharmaceutical industry, and other technological advancements, economic determinations are rapidly and increasingly being integrated into the production of subjectivity. Therefore, to make any separation between what is economic and what is subjective is more complicated than ever. So here is trying to unweave a little bit this idea that the register, the static, and the social political are kind of interrelated. So in order to vindicate, of course, the idea that practices of social dissonance might have an import, this is important for my argument, might have an import beyond the aesthetic, like it might have social political import as well. Of course, there is also the related argument that Mattin doesn't make, but for instance, our good friend Vladimir Safatli makes, that the aesthetic by itself also has social political kind of valence, which is a little bit different from what Mattin's book is doing, but it is a kind of has some relationship to that. And this is something that interests me to understand if that is the case or not. So there are 3 layers of mediation of our experience, according to Mattin, that you could also be useful to conceptualize 3 different concepts of agent. This is something that is also in the new text, like Mattin talks about a self, he talks about individual, he talks about a subject, right? And there are the 3 layers of mediations that you can almost map onto these 3 notions. In a certain sense, this is my reading. Mattin doesn't go that far in saying that it can be a mapping between these mediations and the respective concepts of individual and self and subject. But anyway, first, mediation by being engaged in the exchange abstractions, commodity form, exchange relation of capitalist relations. This is first mediation. 2, at the neurobiological level, where neural processes produce a phenomenal representation in which an individual information processing system generates a reality model, a model of yourself. Here, Mattin also shows his scholars in terms of what kind of neuroscience or neuroscientific theory he's endorsing, which is Thomas Metzinger's theory, okay? This is a kind of important thing as well. So, and the 3rd, through the conceptual mediation of language, which in turn is developed through sociality. In short, it is not only objects that are fetishized and appear in a form of spectral objectivity, but experience itself. So, from what I understand of Mattin's argument, the first, of course, exchange abstraction in a certain sense up to through the mediations give rise to what we call individuals in a certain sense, which is also an almost juridical kind of form. At the neurobiological level, it is selves that are involved, or the illusion of a self or a phenomenal self model. There's a whole debate around that I won't get much into. Maybe Renzo want to discuss it afterwards. This would be very interesting to have a discussion, but this is not something that I'm very savvy about. And third, through the conceptual mediation of language, right? For me, the conceptual mediation of language is something that cuts across all the mediations in a certain sense. And this is why I understand that it's important for Mattin to give a criticism of, for instance, neo-rationalism, Reza-Negarestani, this kind of thing, in order to differentiate this kind of cutting across, this kind of importance of language from a certain generative importance of language. We'll be talking about that in soon. So our experience is already conceptually mediated, but at present we are not in control of how concepts mediate our experience. Now, the problem cannot be mediations as such, otherwise there will be no hope at all, but the capitalist colonization of these mediations. Fortunately, we do not have the cognitive capacity to understand. We do have the cognitive capacity to understand these mediations and to act upon them. When we actively conceptualize our experience, we involve ourselves in a fight for a new form of mediation. This is an all-important kind of paragraph for me, but in this book, like the idea of a fight for a new form of mediation, in a certain sense, as what is to be conquered, right? According to what the book Social Dissonance is proposing. So it's not going back to an unmediated immediacy or primitive kind of giveness, anything like that. Like it's going further, the mediation pipe and constructing almost a kind of new form of mediation. And of course, language is a kind of central medium for that. So fight for a new form of mediation. So here also he talks about Sellers, and Sellers appears as a very central figure to his argument. As Wilfried Sellers suggests, the sapient-sentience distinction hinges on the sapient being able not just to perceive something, but to perceive something as something, i.e. through conceptual mediation. If selfhood is a form of reification, then further mediation of this sort, further alienation, is necessary in order to gain sufficient awareness to perceive the self as commodified and to understand how this commodification occurs. This understanding of alienation, non-essential and non-teleological, doesn't need to presuppose full agency and the already available possibility of expressing freedom, as was the case with the situationist construction of situations. There's this paragraph is taken from a little section where Mattin is criticizing the situationists, right? Or in the concept of free improvisation. Instead, it assumes alienation as a negative condition we can be taken as a starting point in order to develop the necessary reflexive distance to perceive ourselves as something. This reflexivity is perhaps not yet agency, but it would allow us gradually to develop a conceptual grasp of the different levels of mediation in which we are embedded. So in a certain sense, because of this importance of Sellers, it justifies in a certain sense. There's a whole, of course, I'm not getting too much into the debate about alienation, because Mattin also revisits the relevant literature, 19th century literature, the debate between Marx and the left Hegelians, in order to harness the concept of alienation that is important, or the concepts of alienation that are important. But anyway, I take it that the importance of Sellers justifies the contemporary debates also that Mattin is having with, for instance, neo-rationalism. So, and I think neo-rationalism is an important kind of enemy in this book, because it also makes Mattin kind of bring over Sohn-Rethel as a criticism of neo-rationalism. So this is how I understand the way the argument is structured. So, and then he makes his critique on Reza, drawing on multiple sources, including pragmatism, computational science, recent developments in mathematics, and more importantly, German idealism. Negarestani claims that artificial general intelligence, AGI, offers the possibility of achieving the radical transformation of the human, a possibility that can be conceptually grasped by understanding intelligence as Geist. In his case, a Hegelian notion of alienation lies at the core of the argument. But if we assume, as Negarestani seems to, that it is the mind that is responsible for initiating, this is important, and for persevering in the labor of the inhuman, the process of alienation through forms of externalization by initiating the artifactualizing of the world and of itself, then we miss some of the most important lessons that we learned from Marx. Alienation as a process of externalization is instead produced by our practical activities as part of our reproduction. Mind is determined by this process, but is not fully able to comprehend it. So for me, this is very interesting because at the same time, they share this kind of interesting relationship to a certain philosophy of language, Sellers particularly. But whereas usually there is a wager on this. I'm trying to be really fair to Reza, right? There's this kind of notion of a certain sufficiency of reason, in a certain sense, even if reason needs the material supports of, bodies and nature and all of that. In a certain sense, it is reason that gains the kind of agency over the whole process in a certain sense. So it's much more Hegelian in that sense, whereas Mattin, still recognizing kind of that same basic philosophy of language, is trying to actually embed this much more in the material world and see much more the ways the material goings on give rise to these capacities of self-understanding and these elements of this philosophy of language that are common to both in a certain sense. So it's a kind of interesting comparison to make between Reza and Mattin in a certain sense. But anyway, so because of that, now we're getting to what is most interesting for us here. Until now is kind of introducing the book. Mattin goes to Sohn-Rethel. So real abstraction mind screw is the first, which is I love this. I use this also in the text because I like the mind screw expression. Is the first moment that Sohn-Rethel makes an appearance in the book. So here it goes. If the dialectical process does not occur in the mind, but in our social reproduction and in the relationship that we have to nature, none of which is immediately available to the mind, then here the concept of real abstraction can help us to clarify the mind's inability to access the social processes that capitalism involves us in. For the real of real abstraction has to do precisely with a process which is social, but is not easily traceable or accessible to our understanding. The non-empirical character of real abstraction produces a spectral objectivity, an objectivity that feels so natural, robust, and stable that it impedes us from understanding its mechanisms. Our cognitive categories and assumptions are marred in this spectrality, which therefore troubles easy categorizations between idealism and materialism. Without taking into account the complexity involved in the processes of real abstraction, mind is subject to a form of blindness. So yeah, I was going to improvise something now, but I actually wrote it down. So awareness and mediation. Let me see. Yeah, I have to. Yeah, this was the first real abstraction intervention comes in against Reza. The second real abstraction intervention comes in against Metzinger or even Sellers in the second part of the book. The book, I forgot to mention, the book is divided in three. So we have very neatly those three layers of mediation kind of also represented in the structure of the book. Like the first one, exchange abstraction, commodity form. The first part, which is called alienation from above. The second neurobiological level is kind of what Mattin calls alienation from below. And then the third, of course, language, he's talking about language all the time. But the third is the externalizing alienation, which is actually his conceptualization of how to bring about the social dissonance in practice. And for that, you have to, in a certain sense, presuppose or construct a certain form of agency that is able to produce these effects and and also in turn recognize its own unfreedom in a certain sense. So there's a paradox there, because you have to have the kind of relative freedom gained through language in order to assess this unfree state and make it manifest to these agents that also are concept mongering also, and are able then to recognize their own freedom. Okay, so so I'm not sure we need this, perhaps for the non-Salesians amongst us, awareness and mediation. So also Mattin presents something about the myth of the given, and Sellers in a very elegant and very summarized, compressed form. So there are two variants of the myth of the given: the epistemic variant, which confuses thinking with sensing, and the categorical variant, which confuses sensing with sensing as. So thinking and sensing, like sensing just is like a detection by your sensible apparatus. Thinking, of course, thinking conceptually and making inferences and this kind of thing. And sensing as, it's more complex than sensing for Sellers. Like sensing is just having contact, sensible contact with stuff, while sensing as is having sensible contact with stuff, but recognizing stuff as being of a certain kind. So you can sense like the table before me, which is in a certain sense not sensing a table. It will be more like sensing, I don't know, a patch of brown, and sensing as I sense it as a table. I understand this patch of brown color as being a table. This is kind of the difference. Sensory awareness is not awareness as. So awareness of something as being something is already conceptualization. This is Sellers' wager. So it is awareness, it is sensing, but it is sensing with the participation of the concept, sensing as, right? Public candid speech is embedded in a community of speakers that have acquired metalinguistic resources through which they are able to talk about talk, thereby generating self-consciousness in regard to the normative rules for the thinking process. This process is linked to what Sellers calls awareness as. However, crucially for Sellers, as Brassier writes, Ray Brassier, the awareness of something is not the awareness of something as something. We are just discussing that. Awareness of something as a certain type of thing or as having a certain property is conceptual and therefore requires language. This is not to say that a perceiver cannot be aware, sensory awareness, in the sense of sensory awareness, of red without having language at its disposal, but that a perceiver cannot be aware of it as red, which is cognitive awareness, unless it has at its disposal the concept of red. So being aware of redness is one thing. Being aware of something, that something is red, is a different thing, right? Redness, okay, redness is kind of a sensory thing, and aware of the proposition, this is red, is a different thing. And by implication, the collectively established set of rules of language in which this concept is caught up. On the contrary, Sellers insists you can have awareness of inner representational states, which are not awarenesses of those states as representational states. And here we find something similar to Metzinger's darkness. Such an erroneous assumption reiterates the myth of the given, because it suggests that concepts are just directly read of awareness items on a one-to-one basis, which is, of course, not just the myth of the given, but also a certain specific form of philosophy of language in a certain sense, which is, again, the representational picture, pure representational picture of, having names as labels of things. You have a one-to-one relationship between things out there and names and things like that. So this is not compatible with the critique of the given in that sense. So without the involvement of any inferential relationships, i.e. without the involvement in the complex web of language and its collectively established rules. So the way I read this, the participation of Sellers in Mattin's argument is that if we need more mediations and construct a new form of mediation, language is an interesting medium, because the way, and particularly the way Sellers understands it, because language then is already a kind of alienated medium in a certain sense. You are subjected to language, you are talker, you are speaker, you are subjected to language, but it is language also that creates a certain degree of separation between things and us in a certain sense. So this is kind of the idea. And the way our conceptual frameworks are embedded in inferential relationships that are changeable and historically changeable, right? Is a kind of a degree of alienation from what is out there in a certain sense. So we may be able to conceptualize things differently, even if this does not entail that the things are within language, they are out there, but the conceptualizations have a kind of a relative degree of autonomy in a certain sense. So you have embedded in the philosophy of language that is employed here a certain form of alienation that is important, that it's not as present, for instance, in the representational picture. So, and also a second element which is important and it's compatible with Marx is the sociality, the sociality of language. Language is, of course, something that is a game played by a certain kind of community, a certain kind of socius. Okay, so as creatures of concepts, we articulate ourselves through the game of giving and asking for reasons, an attribute that opens up the possibility of our becoming aware of ourselves as discerning the different forms of alienation in which we are involved and their interconnection, from the subsumption of our social relations to the generation of self-models, to the level of sociality achieved through language. This provides us with a pivotal capacity to expose and manipulate the mystificatory self-models in which we are embedded through rational description and inference. So there's a lot involved, or a lot hangs on language in Mattin's account. So Sohn-Rethel again. So the second intervention. This is why I constructed this in this way. Like we have neo-rationalism. First, real abstraction. Irrationalism upholds a certain sufficiency of reason. Sohn-Rethel comes in and says, no, reason is not sufficient. Of course, there is reason. There is a kind of, even Salarian reason for Mattin, but Sohn-Rethel is there to say, oh, you need to have material, not only material supports as agents, but material supports in the sense of social processes that we are not immediately aware of in order to give rise to these powers. Okay, so first intervention. Second intervention, you have all these talk about language, and the second intervention comes in as an intervention upon that. Ultimately, neither Seller's nor Metzinger's theory takes into account how real abstraction, as the social actuality of abstraction through the subsumption of labor under value, produces abstractions in thought, such as the individual selfhood, the state, and so on. Therefore, they cannot provide the full resources for understanding revolutionary subjectivation. Of course, in a certain sense, you have is a kind of I would say perhaps the Salarian alienation is both a feature and a bug, in a certain sense. Like it's a feature because you have the degree of freedom from the given in order to be able to revise things, but at the same time, it is a bug in the sense that the relationship of these logical resources and the material practices that give rise to them is mystified, right? So under current conditions, our capacity for thinking is embedded within the valorization process of capital. Sohn-Rethel takes as a starting point Marx's materialist conception of history. It is not the consciousness of men that determine their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. But Sohn-Rethel takes this thesis a step further, extending the critique of ideology beyond the realms of legal, political, religious, aesthetic, and philosophical thinking to encompass the entire conceptual foundations of our cognitive faculty. We then have the emergence of coinage. And according to Sohn-Rethel, when coins are used in the market, the use value of the coin as metal is estranged and instead serves as the generally recognized equivalent of all other commodities, and in its value represents quantitative parcels of social labor in the abstract. This produces a non-empirical form of abstraction, which leads to the formation of non-empirical concepts of pure thought, resembling the abstract materiality of money in thought, but without taking into account its social origins. Sohn-Rethel argues that Parmenides' equation of being with the one, that which is that which is represents a prime example of this. So this is, yeah, in a nutshell, Sohn-Rethel's, I'll skip a little bit, Sohn-Rethel's argument. So again, just to take stock, the two Sohn-Rethel is this. Yeah, no, we can go directly. The two Sohn-Rethel interventions against neo-rationalism, it offers an argument for the social world as the origin of abstraction, which is the mind screw. And against the solipsism of alienation from below, it offers the social nexus constitutive of subjectivity. So against neo-rationalism, the problem is the sufficiency of reason, right? So the social world is the origin of the abstractions that are transmitted to reason. And against the solipsism, the methodological solipsism of Metzinger, or even Sellers, perhaps. I don't think Sellers is a methodological solipsist, but anyway, maybe his conception of sociality regarding reason is insufficient. It offers the social nexus constitutive of subjectivity. Well, it offers the idea that subjectivity is social all the way down. So in both cases, it reorients the argument towards a social medium that is arguably absent from both Neurath and Sellers and Metzinger. At the same time, as seen in the previous slide, Mattin's argument is cognitive in its purport. It's a matter of gaining conscience of these forms of alienation in order to change them. The political valence of the aesthetic techniques he comments upon depends on that level of conscience. So here we have a kind of a problem. Just to remember, social synthesis and real abstraction, like the official Sohn-Rethelian paragraphs. So social synthesis is a network of relations by which society forms a coherent whole. As social forms develop and change, so also does. Just a second. Oh, weird. Just a second. Just a second. Just a sec. No, this is not. This is the old version. Where are my graphs? I was thinking something strange was going on. Okay. Now I have my graphs. Okay. So, okay. Yeah, here we go. So, yeah. So I was, then you have this problem, as I was saying, the political valence of aesthetic techniques depends on that level of conscience. So we have kind of, I think, two different problems, right? That comes from that. First, if we need a certain problem, if we need a certain political valence to consciousness in a certain sense, this amounts to what I was calling in the paper the problem of attraction from conception to praxis in a certain sense. So the changes in conception would be able to change practice. So this is what I was calling the problem of theoretical practice, right? Using Althusser's way of understanding the production of a scientific situation from an ideological situation. So here in the graph, I was proposing to have this basic pair, conception and practice, right? And conception represents practice. Like this is not to say that it represents successfully, but it purports to represent successfully. This is kind of the normal situation, the quotidian situation, the ideological situation, right? So theoretical praxis has to do with taking these relationship in a certain sense and developing a conception to a different kind of object from out of what we take to be the objects that are embedded in our ideological situation. And these new conceptions are able to redescribe practice in a certain sense. Okay, this is the kind of circuit, like conception and praxis kind of belong together in the ideological situation. Conception too comes about through theoretical praxis. You'd redescribe the practice, but then practice goes on as before. It's not, this by itself does not entail a change in practice, right? In a certain sense, maybe it will entail a certain kind of conscience, a certain consciousness of our own freedom, but by itself, it does not entail a political change. So the first practice mapping onto the problem of theoretical determination of practice takes its cue from Althusser's notion of theoretical practice. This I'm kind of importing Althusser just because I think it is a kind of heuristically good way to understand this problem, right? Where he offers the view that the construction of scientific knowledge doesn't take as initial data experiential items so much as already theoretically determined data. So the idea is that, of course, the ideological situation would be, in a certain sense, a kind of previous scientific situation. Like you have like the formation of a kind of a second nature, whereby these conceptions are naturalized and taken as what is the case. And a theoretical practice is there to produce a new object of knowledge, right? So in the diagram, this is portrayed in the direct relationship between conception and practice that is called ideological situation. This relationship between conception and practice is the initial building block of all the diagrams in this presentation, which are intended as ways of showing the fly out of bottle of ideological representations of practice. So I will always be using, or almost always, there is one exception in the CSII graph, I'll be using the pair conception and practice, like in order to separate what is a change in conception, what is a change in practice that might entail a change in conception, what is a change in conception that might or might not entail a change in practice, okay? So there are ideological representations of the practice and ideological constraints from practice to conception from the side of practice, determined through the capitalist operational scheme. So this is clear from the second diagram, which is the social dissonance, the simplified social dissonance graph. This is a simplified one. There is a more complex one by the end, but this is a simplified one. You have practice constraining conception. The second step here is a step that dissociates practice from practice, which is what Mattin is doing in performance. Like there's a myriad of different ways, really, but the idea is to produce a certain form of discomfort with what we are doing, right? So one practice dissociates into a second practice, which changes conception. And this is just done really almost automatically, 2 and 3, right? You dissociate what is the usual goal-oriented practice into a non-goal-oriented practice, and this changes what we think we are doing in a certain sense. It changes conception, but it by itself is not evident that it transforms this conception into a second kind of conception, right? It just changes conception in a certain sense of producing a certain form of discomfort and a certain form of questioning. What am I really doing, right? And this is kind of the first step into producing what we've been discussing here for like 40 minutes now, the social dissonance aspect. So practice dissociates into practice 2, which changes conception, which then transforms into conception 2. And of course, arrow 4 and 5 are results of 2 and 3 in a certain sense. So practice 2 then have to generate conception 2, which is also the result of the transformation from conception 1 to conception 2. And then you have this concept, which I taken from Renzo's and Vitor's presentation, the hustle of the struggle, which is, I think it's really helpful, which is the concept of a boundary, like the idea that you have a certain kind of process going inside a certain element, and the types of relationship that these stuff that is going inside have with the outside are not automatic or immediate or of the same type of the type of relations that are going on inside the boundary. So what's interesting here, and what this diagram is articulating for me, is not just here, which is simpler, the idea that a new conception should have an effect upon practice, even if mostly doesn't, right? And the second part is about you have a new practice in a certain sense, like a socially dissociated practice, but what kinds of transmission does that practice have towards its outside, right? So this is why we have a boundary. And the boundary here is, of course, a boundary that is also composed by of course, the audience, the community where the social dissonance is going on, but also kind of an art world boundary, because contingently or not, which is a good question to ask. Is it necessarily an art practice, or is it just contingently made within an art context? Like you have this boundary that within this space, this is kind of acceptable, and outside of this space, it's not. And how does that transmit to its outside, right? This is a kind of a problem. So going back to where I was. So the social synthesis is a network of relations by which society forms a coherent whole. As social forms develop and change, so also does the synthesis which holds together the multiplicity of links operating between men according to the division of labor. For every society made up of a plurality of individuals is a network coming into effect through their actions. How they act is of primary importance for the social network. What they think is of secondary importance. This is social synthesis according to Sohn-Rethel. So the idea that you have certain social nexuses that maintain social reproduction and the form of a kind of a socius and reproducing itself, right? So this is why it's a synthesis, but it's a synthesis of a social kind. So abstraction, exchange contains a postulate of the equality of two lots of commodities to be exchanged. How do we define this equality? The equality is not the identity of the commodities, since only different commodities are exchanged for one another, nor are they equal in the evaluation of the exchanging agents, as it reduces their action to an absurdity if they did not see an advantage to themselves in performing. Of course, they have to exchange different things, otherwise they wouldn't exchange. They would keep the stuff they already have, right? So they are equated by virtue of being exchanged. They are not exchanged by virtue of any equality which they possess. And also, of course, in this paragraph, it is embedded the idea that you are not thinking about the equality. You are thinking about the difference, and then you exchange, and the equality is established by how you act. This weaves into the last sentence of social dissonance, the social dissonance definition. How they act is of primary importance. What they think is of secondary importance because of that, right? They think something, but they act because what they think, they act in a certain way as to bring about an effect that is not predicted from the point of view what they are thinking, right? So why is this important? Well, in a certain sense, I think I'm betting that there is a kind of an important role for social synthesis here, because you have a certain practice. You want this practice that happens within an artistic context to have a political valence. But in order to have a political valence, it seems to me to be able to transmit itself in a certain way to the outside of the enclosed space of the practice, in a certain sense. So this is why I think social synthesis is a good way to put forward this problem. I have a few examples of that. I won't necessarily give them today. We discussed kind of the difference between what Cage is doing, for instance, in Atlas Criticality, what Cardio is doing. They have different social syntheses, and you can deal in social synthesis within aesthetic practice, which is a kind of interesting thing. And it also it's related to what Mattin says, like what is an important element of social dissonance, which is to use the audience as an instrument. Therefore, you can tinker with the social synthesis that is going on in a certain aesthetic space, and also think about what kinds of transmission does that tinkering have to the space outside of that enclosed space. So the Sohn-Rethel problem, why is this important to me? Like then I try to also make a diagram to what we've been discussing about real abstraction in order to make this kind of more manifest. So this is what I call the problem, and this is the solution in a certain sense. The problem is you have constrain and represent like two different relations between practice and conception. Then practice by itself generates real abstraction, and real abstraction is transmitted to conception. Kind of this is what Sohn-Rethel says sometimes very polemically, and you don't really see how real abstraction gets transmitted to conception in order to give rise to modern science and the mathematized science and the Greek philosophy and the Kantian transcendental subject, right? Which are Sohn-Rethel's preferred examples. So what is interesting for us here is the fact that you have a certain specific material practice that then transforms conception. So you have the same graph, right? But real abstraction, what happens is that real abstraction demands and enables coinage, and Mattin mentions that. And coinage, it is coinage that is something that is, the coin is empirical, but the value is non-empirical. So you have this coincidence in the world of something that you are seeing, right, in action, that abstracts from its own empirical qualities, and this gets transmitted. This kind of, you could almost intuitively grasp something like this gives us ideas. Like you have kind of this space of justifications where you can exchange something by this representative of value, right? And this by itself kind of insinuates itself in conception, like the idea, for instance, of substance, something that is beyond its empirical accidents, for instance. And all these ideas of philosophy and science then are produced by that. So this is just to make explicit the Sohn-Rethelian idea, and the idea which is important for the rest of my argument. I read that. In a sense, the appeal to Sohn-Rethel offers a response to the first question we posed at the beginning of this paper, the question of the relationship between theoretical reason and praxis. The Sohn-Rethel example, if we take to be correct beyond its historical vagueness, because you have like a kind of shaky historical grounds in some of Sohn-Rethel's work, the part 2 of the book, for instance, makes it plausible to think of a circuit of determination that comes from practice to thought and vice versa. Instead of thinking of it as a materialist debunking of epistemology, you might think of it as an account of the way thought integrates after the effect, the accidental results of the social practice, determined back the latter as new categories are devised within language, in cognitive friction with material practice. From this point of view, Sohn-Rethel is a thinker of functional bootstrapping. So in a certain sense, this kind of gives credence to Mattin's version of, Salesianism in a certain sense, which is a kind of dialectics between a certain practice that has a friction with material practice and comes up with new frameworks in order to understand these material practice and vice versa, right? So, and then you have this, then I come to the CSII. The argument here is that I think there is a kind of isomorphism between the problem of the traction between one enclosed space and its outside, which we see in social dissonance, and what happened with the CSII. Like this was also part of the presentation that I did before, but I developed a little bit more with some diagrams and all that. So I'm not sure. I think I'll have to revisit the functioning of the CSII. So let's now take a look at 4 different aspects of this formal structure. The CSII, of course, the subset has it as its, in a certain sense, the name at least. Subset of theoretical practice comes from the circle, right? Because this is why we are called a subset. But the circle was had these formal protocols, and the idea that these formal protocols, in a certain sense, would suspend specific contents or ways we take us as being, right, in a certain sense. And this is kind of similar to social dissonance in a certain sense. It's almost like the circle was performing a certain kind of social dissonance, different from what Mattin is doing, but in a certain sense, through a different set of tools, which are purely formal tools, right? So we have like the entry form, and in order to join the group, one has to fill out an admittance form divided into sections, one demanding objective information about the candidate, so give your name, your telephone, whatever. Another asking for the proponents to write a commentary on the circle's project. So the commentary was kind of, we didn't evaluate the commentary. This is important. What was important is that the candidate fill out the form. They had to write something about the project. And if they wrote something about the project, they were in. We didn't want to evaluate the content of what was written, just the fact that it was responded, that it was answered, right? So this is Gabriel. I think, this is Gabriel's, a quote by Gabriel's text, Free Thought from Thinkers. In this sense, the admittance from form functions a bit like the door of the law in Kafka's parable. It looks like an examination will take place, And many people do in fact become paralyzed before the obscurely simple criteria of entry. But the only wrong answer is to dismiss the examination as illegitimate. So you could write anything. If you wrote, as long as you wrote, you're in. Permanence. The entry form is not a determining operator of belonging in the circle's logic, rather than deriving consistency from a mechanism that distinguishes the inside from the inside of the collective. CSII relies on a different protocol, which privileges the connection of one meeting to the next, the work note. Once someone is accepted into the circle, the only necessary commitment of this participant is to write, after every meeting, a short anonymous note of any content whatsoever. Every cell meets on a weekly basis, but once present in these meetings is in fact considered secondary to the handing in of the work notes. So the work notes are the thing. And the work note is very, I think it's the most whimsical, but also the most important and interesting kind of thing, which is you could write anything. It's almost like the entry form. You have to write anything. So the order write anything makes us wonder what is expected from us to be writing in a certain sense. And by writing what we think what is expected from us in a certain sense, we are revealing how we see the group in a certain sense. So this is an interesting protocol in order to make the group read itself in a certain sense. Of course, we are actually reading something of the way people are, individual agents are seeing themselves with regard to the group. But the fact that we can bet on the fact that they are writing what they think is expected in a certain sense reveals how they are seeing the group in a certain sense. So this is an interesting result. So in the circle, the indeterminate space created by the purely formal character, this is again Gabriel, of the work notes produces a similar absence, which is equally followed by a certain form of transferential work of displacements and suppositions concerning other members and the group itself. This enactment or realization of transference ultimately allows the circle to treat some of its obstacles and the other who would be responsible for such interdictions as objects of interpretation, even though there is no one in the position of an analyst. As it turns out, the analytic effects in a collective need to be formally homogeneous with the site of their intervention in order to produce any sort of effective transformation, which is an interesting also point. I didn't think of that. I'm just thinking of that this now, the idea of the homogeneity, which also helps with the conceptualization of the boundary in a certain sense, because the boundary is exactly, in a certain sense, it seems to be the passage through an heterogeneous medium, right? So this is why social synthesis is a way to understand this, because what we want is to have a kind of social nexus that is able to produce a synthesis and transmit some of the effects from the inside to the outside. At least in this paper, I was considering this. Okay, so C positions. Then there's the +1 and the general secretary. The +1 received the work notes and gave back to the group the work notes. They had to read in every meeting the work notes produced for the last meeting, right? So and the +1 is of course also a rotating position. So it's also a way for the group to produce effects on the group that comes from the latest effect that was produced, because you have to give back the work note that was written the last time. And this is something from Mattin again, which I'm relating to a bit, which is a kind of a common space in a certain sense between which is an element for both in a certain sense from that comes from the suspension of immediate goals that are present both in social dissonance and in CSII in a certain sense. So this is how Mattin talks about what is the effect of social dissonance, which is the estrangement of estrangement. This is an important thing because it will guide an important result, even diagrammatic result, that is a kind of a representation of representation in a certain sense. And I take it to be these to be present both in the CSII, both through social dissonance. So the precondition for producing tension is a suspension of the contract and consensual presupposition between audience and performance. This is in social dissonance. If this tension occurs, we do not relate to each other according to the terms of this consensus because the elements necessary to constitute it have been removed. In this sense, the situation ungrounds itself, which is kind of similar to what we are talking about the CSI in certain sense, like the situation ungrounds itself because we don't know what we are supposed to be writing in the work note, right? We only know that we have to write something. It forces everyone involved to think without their having a totally prescribed role or task. And in this process, a collective self-consciousness emerges. Maybe it's a very strong affirmation from Mattin, but anyway, we lose the ability to relate either to ourselves or to each other, established selves or liberal individuals. And this forces participants to think about their relations to one another without prefiguration, no longer the impoverished sociality of the consumer, nor that of the emancipated spectator, but a suspension of clear-cut roles where people become able to experience and explore their own conditioning, their unfreedom. This then is what I refer to externalizing alienation, producing estrangement while simultaneously incorporating the process of decipherment of what is strange into the experience of noise. This inevitably goes beyond a mere aesthetic experience because it undermines certain assumptions of what experience as such is and what you are as a receiver of aesthetic experience. So, yeah, no, it's okay. So here's a kind of the question, right? Are we spinning in a void? Which is, of course, a provocative question, because as interesting as it is, these protocols, in a certain sense, gives way to the question about what is being produced beyond the enclosed spaces. I have in the text, this is not here in the presentation, but I have in the text a hypothesis, which is not original, I think, of course. But there is a hypothesis about the different spaces wherein these protocols, the social dissonance protocol and the CSII protocol happens, right? The CSII is not so much a political intervention in the social world, but intervention into the political world or intervention into the militant world. So it's a kind of a second order intervention. Of course, it had for me like a huge transformational effect, but it's kind of difficult to track its effects upon the social world at large. And the same about social dissonance. I never experienced Mattin's performance of social dissonance, but from secondhand accounts, it can be very transformative. But at the same time, the question is left hanging whether this transmits itself as a directly political thing or not, in a certain sense, right? Like it's an intervention upon not the art world, but in the individuals that are in the enclosed space that is usually the art world. So the pressing question is whether SD and CSII are producing new social synthetic functions or are relying on pre-existing ones, as long as the suspension of ordinary protocols demand a form of stability and constancy that would be found in some social synthesis being activated. In the case of CSII, the overt rules seem to stabilize enough, but the lack of an explicitly stated political goal, which is, of course, part and parcel of the protocol, may shift the focus of the group to an aesthetic in a broad sense endeavor. Like aesthetic in a broad sense, I mean an endeavor relating to visibility, but the visibility of themselves, right? The visibility of the organization itself to itself. In the case of SD, the suspension of protocol seems to rely on the disinterestedness that is already part and parcel of the operational scheme of the art world. But the fact that the material of the practice is not the autonomous aesthetic forms of music or art, etc., instead focusing on the social matter, makes it amenable to be read as a form of politics. So, but at the same time, there is a kind of a filtering or a kind of a barrier in the boundary. So this is kind of the problem. I don't think this is very good. But anyway, so I'm taking back this diagram, which is part of the the STP. Sorry, let me take this from. I'm not sure if you. Okay, that was part of the STP the latest working through political organizations, which is the theory of social mediation, right? That there's this idea of an individual agent that have a certain relationship to the social world, right? And there's a normal relation. Remember that I call this a normal or ideological situation in my own graphs. I'm finishing, guys. Just a second, just a few minutes. So in my own graphs, I call this, like in the theoretical practice one, ideological situation. But it's not just a relationship between agent and world; it's between conception and practice anyway. But this is the nature of this shift is something that I still have to think about. But because of the nature of social dissonance, I had to separate conception and practice and not treat the social agent as one, right? But anyway, this is kind of there is a kind of a ideological situation or normal situation going on, which is what does that mean? It has the same meaning of the relationship between the individual agent and the social world, which is depicted in the arrow number 1, right? Which is there's a normal situation where the individual agent sees himself, herself, as part of the social world and with a normal, ideologically enforced role, right? So you have social mediations between this agent and the social world, you have his job. Well, his job is part of the world. So the idea is that arrows 2 and 3 reduce to arrow 1. They depict the same relationship. The relationship from 2 and 3, the composition of this relationship is still 1, right? So this is a kind of a conservative mediation or a normal situation. What is interesting to us, to the STP, is the situation wherein you have a social mediation that does not commute, does not make the triangle commute.
Marcado para cativa, mas a gente pode descer na Serra Corá que a gente vai no...
Yes, somebody, I think it's Eduarda has her mic on. What is interesting to us is the fact that you have a social mediation that adds something to the world in a certain sense. So the relationship between the individual agent and the social mediation, and between the social mediation and the world, does not reduce to the relationship between individual agent and social world as depicted in the arrow number 1. So arrow number 1 is not the composition between 2 and 3, which is here, right? Conservative mediation, like you have 1 is equal to the composition between 3 and 2, right? And the political mediation, 1 is different from the composition between 3 and 2, which means the political mediation or the social mediation adds something that is not already embedded in the world. There's a justification of that. I won't get into that, and I don't get into that in the paper because it will be too long. The idea of we all know that the political mediation is part of an ecology of organizations, which makes the triangle commute, produces another relationship between an individual agent number 2 and a social world number 2 anyway. But I take something from that result in my diagrams in order to depict what's going on in the CSII and in SD, okay? So in social dissonance here, both have the same form. You have the STP triangle on top, and both are political mediations. Therefore, they don't commute. They have to produce a different arrow that will be the composition of 2 and 3, which is not the normal situation or ideological situation, what I deemed the ideological situation in the theoretical practice graph. So the idea is that, social dissonance, then you have this, our conception has a relationship to social dissonance, and this produces a different kind of conception, which is a different relationship to practice, right? The fact that you have the double conception and practice produced as a second form of conception and practice, in a certain sense, makes it a representation of the original ideological situation. But by being a representation of the original ideological situation, you don't have a simple doubling of the situation. You have to have something that is different in order to have the representation of representation, which is as we were discussing before, the awareness as. Whereas in the ideological situation, we have naturalized awareness going on between conception and practice. The socially dissonant situation makes it so that the relationship between conception and practice is figured or is represented for each agent as our relationship between conception and practice. So therefore, I locate in the shift between arrow 1 and arrow 4, this idea of a representation of representation, which keeps the same kind of pair, but of course with a certain difference, because the first pair does not add up as the composition of 2 and 3, whereas the 4 does add up as a composition between 2 and 3. And so therefore, and also as an alienation of alienation, if we understand that even if one is a relationship between conception and practice, it is an alienated one. So you introduce also, this vindicates the idea that we introduce further alienation in order to make us paradoxically, in a certain sense, less alienated, in the sense of us being able to represent our representation and to feel our unfreedom as unfreedom in a certain sense. So this is what I take to be indexed, indicated in this graph. And I think the same is going on in the CSII. This is kind of, for me, it was an interesting result. But I replaced conception and practice with individual agent and political organization. And this is why I did that. Because I wanted to make sense of the boundary. You see in the bottom of each graph, the idea that you have a boundary of a certain type. So the social dissonance boundary is an art world kind of boundary. It remains to be discussed or concluded if this is necessary or contingent, because is social dissonance an art practice, or is social dissonance a more general practice that happens to happen within the art world? So this is a further question. But anyway, up to now, it's happening within the art world, right? And the CSII was a political collective, of course. And I wanted to make sense of the fact that what kind of action is the CSII doing, in a certain sense. It is not really doing an action directly in the social world at large, right? It's not like this, in a certain sense. It is, but there is something here that you have to open up to understand in the social world pole. What is a further mediation that makes the political mediation that is a CSII have an effect on the social world at large? There's a further one, right? And the further one is what I was calling a militant world. There's the world of militancy. So many people who were in the CSI were already engaged in different organizations and things like that. So in a certain sense, what the CSI gave us was effects upon our militant practice, and the militant practice itself was purported to have direct effects in the social world at large. So there is a kind of a boundary between this militant world and the social world at large. Actually, there's a boundary between the CSII and the militant world, that is the class or the set of organizations that people were engaged in beyond the CSII, right? So you have kind of this same structure. I'm just replacing conception for individual agent and replacing practice with political organization, not social world at large, but the political organizations. So the CSII performed a kind of political mediation between the individual agent and the political organizations they were part of. So it kind of performed a form of social dissonance in a certain sense. This was kind of an interesting result. So, yeah, I think this is clear enough. The transitivity issue, which is, well, I think I just finished by now. I have still this example of punk, but it's really underdeveloped. It's really quick concluding thing, because what I think it's interesting in punk, just to say it really quick, as a counterexample of the problems that social dissonance might have, is that punk is not necessarily self-referential, right? What was interesting in punk is that, and what is interesting for social dissonance in punk, as an example for me, is that social dissonance is something that happens within aesthetic practice. Punk was something that was an aesthetic practice. Punk had a kind of imperative, like what Badiou would call the trace of the event, which was anyone can do it, right? But anyone can do it is an aesthetic imperative as much as a social imperative. As an aesthetic imperative, what it gave us dissonance, out-of-tuneness, it gave us lots of, let us quote unquote, incompetent music, a lot of noise. as a static information. As social information, what does it give us? What it gave us? Well, it gave us participation of a lot of people and the constitution of a scene around it. So what is this is more like an intuition. What is an intuition of this paper, concluding this paper, was the idea that maybe pure self-referentiality is not homogeneous. Let us use the vocabulary that appeared during this session today. It's not homogeneous enough to make a social syntactic function that will communicate beyond the boundary. In a certain sense, there was effects that were of a political kind in punk that were not necessarily reduced to effects of an aesthetic kind. And this is why, this is because, in what I understand, the imperative that was guiding the practice was already crossing a threshold, in a certain sense, between one practice and the next. So this is why this vindicates, from my point of view, the wager that I placed on social synthesis as a way to make manifest what would be the insufficiencies of social dissonance, in a certain sense, and to explain also as a kind of heuristic device some of the shortcomings that people feel that were there in the CSII, even though I don't feel them as shortcomings, but I understand that what it did, what the thing it was doing was not necessarily what people thought it was doing or people were expecting it to do, in a certain sense. So yeah, this is, I'll stop here.
Could we take that 5-minute break before
Yeah,
debate? Yeah.
Fine. Valeu, Renzo.
Yeah, thanks so much, JP. I cannot thank you enough. This is really, yeah, it gives me a lot of food for thought.
Throw the punches.
Huh?
Throw some punches now.
Uh, I'm cow. I'm cow. I mean, yeah, this.
I'm interested in knowing what whether this changed for you. I mean, you were there like a couple of months back, like 6 months back. I don't remember when that happened, like the presentation, but a lot has changed, right? From that to so, not sure this the argument changed a lot for you, or whether.
No. I mean, it's just the point of pointing towards the limitations of actually working within the boundary. The notion of the boundary. Exactly, that's what it has made the big change.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
This was something
that
very
basically
interesting. Yeah.
because I was criticizing the white cube or the black box
Mhm.
or what I call the ideological cage of cage,
Mhm.
which is okay if you look at it in this micro thing, fair enough. But it is true that in order to fully realize, well, fully will be a revolution at
Mhm.
least, but in order to actually do the work that requires that social dissonance requires, it needs to go beyond the aesthetic realm. I mean, the aesthetic realm has been, where it started, and these ideas were played out. Is that room to maneuver, to try things out, an experimental ground. But it's, I was just thinking when you were presenting that it's like, okay, people just have taken home a little bit of a weird situation, and it's like maybe did something, maybe not, but it's just like, okay, there's no continuity. There's, like the only thing that you can do is maybe either think about it a bit, talk it with other people, maybe read the book, or maybe read your paper, or maybe, or do it again. But like, there is no systematic continuation of dealing with the proposition, which I think requires, as you said, I think it requires. It cannot, if it stays just at the level of a bit of a weird experience, is not much. And I think there is potentiality to go further, but it will require commitment, and it would, like it would require some kind of frame, because the CSI you had a framework, but it's like inevitably you also encountered certain kind of boundaries or some kind of limitations.
Yeah, the problem is I was suggesting social synthesis as a methodological idea in order to locate what are the I say the real relationships. But as you said, like there are relationships that are relationships of thought, right? Of course, you go to the concert and you have a weird experience, and then you keep thinking maybe that changes something, okay, which is all good. But for the directly political purchase of the thing, I was thinking, what kind of organizational influence like this is having, right? And I think there's a difference between the boundaries there, as you mentioned, in a certain sense, the CSII. The boundary was closer to politics, as I was mentioning. In a certain sense, the CSII became kind of an aesthetic experiment because the direct political goals were not met. It was more like a visibility goal, in a certain sense, and this makes it amenable to almost kind of also being seen as a theoretical or aesthetic experiment or something like that. Of course, there were lots of also practical endeavors that were made within the CSII, but these were kind of lateral regarding the protocols, the central thing, right? In a certain sense, it's almost like a supplementation. There was this, and there was also these other things. There was an attempt at sharing results with the party politics and other organizations. There were attempts at sharing results in a certain sense. But yeah, anyway, there's this kind of invisible boundary because of the self-referentiality in a certain sense of the protocols in a certain sense. And I think SD, social dissonance, has the same. But to be fair with you, I'm not sure that, of course, I was proposing social dissonance as a methodological question, but I'm not sure you are at fault in a certain sense, because in a certain sense, the social synthetic thing, for instance, in the example of punk, is the fact that there was a kind of class basis going on already, right? Whereas social dissonance, you are intervening in a kind of a fragmented kind of social milieu in a certain sense. So I'm not sure you can solve this by yourself, just right. Why is it that the imperative of punk is at the same time aesthetic and social? Is it because imperative is aesthetic and social? Of course, it is kind of aesthetic and social at the same time. But why is it that you have a practice that is guided by this idea that is at the same time both? Is it because of the imperative, or is it the imperative is that because there was a kind of social fabric that upholded this idea, right? Where social dissonance, in a certain sense, is a solitary kind of proposition when you propose it, of course, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because with punk, I mean, I'm invested in it. I think it's a very powerful thing. I still do it, but the more I think about it, the more connection I see between, punk and Thatcher, in the sense that
And what? I didn't get that.
I'm Margaret Thatcher.
Thatcher. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
I mean, I just,
Okay.
maybe, like seeing it from the perspective of today, even though you could see that they were very antagonistic, I think it prefigured some of the elements of the neoliberal subjectivity in terms of a kind of Nietzschean, Übermensch, like a kind of possibility of nihilistic individualism that kind of can, out of a tabula rasa, generate a kind of context. Obviously, there were very, very different agendas behind, like, in 77 or them later on, in Thatcher. But, I guess, actually Thatcher got kicked out of the party because she was too radical for the Conservative Party. It was like kind of cutting ties with the people who were, previously. Okay, I'm just being a bit provocative with this, but I understand that there is a kind of a continuation, especially since what we are looking are at the most negative consequences of what has happened. There is there is certain connections, and this is not something that I just came up with it, but like also Adam Curtis in, I think it's hyper-normalization or maybe the Century of the Self, but kind of criticize Patti Smith and the people in the New York downtown, as the ones that were taking the most out of New York when it was fucked up, but then when the real estate market just kicked in, people were not organized enough to,
Oh yeah, there's a
to
limit, of course. But what you're saying, as you can sense from me, is a limit. It's more like a limit of punk or a limit of
Yeah.
then the practice was rotten to the core. I don't think so. It's more like a
No,
limit.
no. I don't think it's
Yeah.
by any means. No, and it's there's there's powers. There's. I mean, as I said, I'm invested in it, and there is like many of the elements that you said. Like radical hierarchizations, and like questioning of aesthetic values. There is so many elements that that are very powerful, but we have to be careful of the romanticizations of it, or the kind of the lifestyle kind of elements that have gotten recuperated or perverted, or but it also has generated an extremely healthy scenes all over the world, and forms of solidarity that are some of the best that I encountered. So yeah, I guess one will have to go into the complexity of it.
Yeah, this
But,
is very superficial. Just a kind of a annotation, really.
yeah,
Of course,
yeah.
this demands a whole different kind of essay. Like, in order, if we want to go into that, what was punk, of course. I was to the very end wondering if I was going to mention it or not, but I think it's kind of heuristically interesting to make sense of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But yeah, I think you just saw very precisely the limitations of the project so far of Social Dissonance, and I think and I'm extremely thankful for that, because it makes me, like seriously kind of question what will be the next step, or what will be, what will be necessary. Is it worth it? Could I find a group of people who will be interested in, actually exploring it outside of the aesthetic realm, and I think, yeah, your experience in the CSI is extremely valuable. So I was wondering if there was like a sense of frustration. You said that it didn't achieve its goals, that CSI didn't achieve its goals. Did this bring some sense of frustration, or because you said like, okay, it almost turned into therapeutic or aesthetic,
Yeah,
almost as a
this was kind of a perception of some members that we are not doing this idea that let's do something. This kind of impatience to have a kind of political effect. This was something that was going on in discussions frequently, right? Like, what the hell are we doing? This kind of thing, like, which maybe indicates this kind of feeling of uneasiness of what we are doing really. What is this, right? I just want to take Gabriel's. I'm not sure if the question is for me or for my team, but let's take Gabriel's question, then we can get back to that. Hey, Gabriel.
Yeah, it has to do with what Mattin just asked, but I have a couple of questions. Also, I mean, I can save other comments for later on. Don't want to just go on, but I think I have a different position or different opinion than Caron on CSI's history. Also, I think it makes sense to me. I don't find that. I find it very justifiable, because a lot of people who were part of the collective, when you ask them today what was interesting about them, they don't mention the rules, the work notes. Not everyone felt like that was a central thing. So there is like many kind of assessments of what it was the core part, what wasn't so crucial. That changes from person to person, including therefore the feeling of whether what was expected was met or wasn't met, and what does that mean. We can go into that a bit, but before I go there, I just wanted to ask a question. I think for both of you, I think it would be really interesting to hear what both of you think, because I was a bit surprised by how Mattin answered you, Caron. when you introduced the idea of boundary early in the presentation, and you said, okay, there's some deeper analogy between CSII and the social dissonance approach. It seemed to me that there is a kind of ambiguous use of the term boundary, because there is a difference between boundary and domain, so to speak. Like, this is happening in a certain domain, pretty much means that even if you were to expand it, there are some things which are not part of that domain. Therefore, it won't touch that thing. Whereas some things can be outside of a boundary, and if that practice is expanded, they might then be included. So, for example, a simple way of making that distinction would be to say, small communist collectives, it's outside of their boundary to actually influence social reproduction at large, but without changing very much what they talk about and how they reason and how they justify what they do, it is reasonable that at some point that set of discussions and practices could be expanded to include these things. Whereas depending on the practice that is happening in an art space, it doesn't matter if everyone is involved in that type of normative challenging and cognitive challenging, it would never include certain things. Just as, you can discuss justice as much as you want, probably creating a just world won't necessarily lead you to revolutionize physics, because it's outside of the domain of those things you're changing, right? So there is a boundary which is, let's say, a constraint within a domain, and there is a boundary that is very closely related to the domain itself, the difference between domains. And I know that all the practices you mentioned, from punk to social dissonance itself, the way that the aesthetic and the social political are connected, it is meant to be very porous. So there is a level in which treating a domain like a boundary might be very relevant. So that doesn't seem irrelevant. But it's different, for example, from what we call in politics an aesthetization process, when a failure happens in an organization and it is stuck with its own inner goals and is unable to change something outside, right? Where aesthetization there is not a mixture of the political and the aesthetics, it's just, let's say, a sort of taking yourself as an end for yourself. And so I just wanted to hear how you make that distinction.
I don't think we did that.
But I mean, if you think that distinction is relevant to what you were talking, because I think it can be formalized differently. And also, I mean, I wonder what Mattin, I'm not sure if he froze. Mattin, are you there? I need to ask him something.
I think the image froze, but...
Yes, I'm here.
Now, here, okay. Yeah, one thing that connects to that I wanted to ask you, because I feel like this is always in the horizon of aesthetic practices, critical artistic practices, which have a politics in their horizon, or a very clear, critical, socialist kind of purview, which is, for example, you can effectively produce an experience of, let's say, Brechtian estrangement, or estrangement from the experience of estrangement, in the sense that we're talking about of removing a kind of fantasy of self-coincidence from the picture and making that. But there is it's almost like, because it's happening in a certain realm with a certain material under certain conditions, it sounds to me like there is a sort of weird corollary that comes in, which is the very fact that this can be enacted neutralizes it to some extent, because if you can do what cannot be done elsewhere, it just brings to light, like it makes visible also the fact that this is being done in artificial conditions, right? So there is this kind of, the fact that Brecht's critical operations of setting the frame of the scene into the scene, things like this, that they can only happen in a displaced way. Also, it creates an uncontrollable aspect of that aesthetic experience, which is it's an estrangement of the aesthetic, not an aesthetic of estrangement. Like, you try to bring politics in, but you invited people to read the situation politically, and that means they will see that they are displaced from politics at the end of the day. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I wonder, I know that like in Brechtian analysis, this was very discussed, that there is a kind of deep level of and Brecht, I think it's one of the great masters of aesthetic embarrassment. Like, he has the best poetry I've ever read about being embarrassed to be politicized, because he knows you should, like, we who wanted to bring kindness couldn't be kind. You know, I'm embarrassed that I survived and my friends didn't, because he's embarrassed that he's doing struggle somewhere else. And he punctuates that all the time. It's not estrangement, it's embarrassment, because he knows that there is such a thing as a political domain, which is not the aesthetic domain. And I feel like this is a weird kind of category that it's hard to pinpoint. And I wonder how it, you know, if it doesn't connect a bit with this when in your answer, that, well, there is an interruption. This goes very far in that direction, right? And it's very interesting. I really like the way Caron created the diagram for this, but it also brings this other aspect to bear, which is how much is this a question of social synthesis, of making it reverberate beyond its limits, and how much the way that it reverberates is the production of a certain embarrassment, that, which is a good thing, it's not a bad thing. The sense that, well, if we're able to produce this here and we're not able to transmit it, that says something else, right? It makes more things visible even. So I'm not sure if it's a weird question, but
No, that's a great question, because I do think that social dissonance does that. There's an embarrassment kind of there's a propagation of embarrassment. I do think that there's something of that. This is something I didn't think about. But I think the second question was more to Mattin, right? The first one, I think, about the boundary, I think the point taken. I think that this is something that I wanted to bring here with you guys exactly for that, to kind of fine-tune the concepts and the diagrams and the tools, basically. But as you said yourself, in a certain sense, like, for specific kind of aesthetic practice like punk and social dissonance and all that, of course, you could, it's arguably that the domain is different from the political domain, but they are from the get-go interested in having this political effect, and particularly, arguably, even social dissonance. Social dissonance is, of course, what Mattin is doing, but Mattin is also somebody who has a history in punk, in this kind of practices that are also not only doing sound music and these kind of things, but are kind of organizing practices as well. What I think is interesting in punk is the fact that it is not only a musical community, but it's an organizing practice. People are organized around the community of, you know, independent DIY music making. That, well, of course, you have like the idea of the individual, do it yourself, but I think it's slightly different. I wouldn't identify DIY in the Thatcherite sense with DIY or most of what's been done in the punk community. And I was a critic of the punk community at some point, because I thought, oh yeah, this is completely parasitic. Of course, this is not something that has any power to change any fundamental rule of society, but nevertheless, it is something that brings people together around not only musical discussions but political discussions. A lot of people I know got politicized because of punk. So this is kind of an interesting kind of effect and a verifiable effect historically of what was being done, right? There's no other, you know, young subculture that discusses politics as much as punk in that sense. So, and that politicizes as much people that gets in contact with it. And this by itself seems to me to be a kind of valuable result. Of course, some of these people will be satisfied in just, you know, doing punk, and some other people will be interested in going further and learning about things and doing things differently and all that. So I do think that punk is a good example that, you know, goes beyond art or music practice in a certain sense. The only problem that I have with my hypothesis, the way I expressed, is that perhaps I am conflating cause for effect. That punk was originally a kind of proletarian culture. And this is what is important. It's not punk. It's the fact that from the get-go, you had like this class character built in. And this class character was kind of important for that, in a certain sense. And it was this class character that propagates beyond, the purely aesthetic ground. This is a strong kind of counter hypothesis, and I concede that.
Yeah, what I think we could do like is create a little machine, which is a normative purificator, like where you can throw away justifications slowly and remain with the fewest needed justifications to still do the same thing, right? So if you imagine a punk guy, he's leaving. I always take this idea, like you're leaving a very comfortable situation where you're at home and you're going to do something that's going to create hassles for you, even sometimes economic hassles, but whatever. You're going to create some hassle. You're going to do something against the grain. And somebody asks you, why are you doing it? Right? I think a good question would be, if your answer, your justification to this is of the sort of, I'm going to get together with people, I'm going to organize the space in this abandoned place to play music because I really want to play music, then the cause is at one place, and the fact that you need to organize with people is a secondary thing. If somebody offers you the same thing without the second, you will take it because that was the motivating cause. Whereas the other thing is, this is the only place I can have fun, amongst my own, where I won't feel judged. Like the social character of of that leisure experience is the core one. And if it is punk, if it is, it has a certain relation to music, it's actually secondary. And if you were to remove the music and substitute it for something else by keeping the social justifications, they would still do it. The kind of connection between punk and fascism as a kind of weird deviation. It's always, a discussion of how did this happen? What's the relation? It points to the fact that probably a subgroup of that culture was with the music, not with the social. So if you substitute the social for something else and you get the same music, that doesn't matter. But there is another part where musically it would be confirmed if it migrated. Like we could have an empirical claim. Like we could prove this by seeing if the same people who were in the punk movement at a certain time migrated aesthetically, but kept the same social basis, right? And then we would say those people were in it for the social experience of it, right? So, but that's kind of, it's mixed together. It's possibly impossible to tell right away because you cannot purify this in reality.
Without sociological research, it's impossible to tell. I think it has some sociological research.
And I'd say that there is probably a class of aesthetic experiments that thrive on that ambiguity, because if you were to purify from the get-go, you wouldn't get one or the other, right? If you were to create a musical experience that is not in tune with a certain social condition, those people would not come because only some people can do it. It would be elitist and so on. If you were to arrive at the same sound via a very erudite procedure, destroy your amp, leave your amp in the rain for a week, buy your clothing somewhere, whatever, come and play for 2 minutes with one string. They wouldn't go. They would feel totally inhibited, And on the other hand, if you were to propose that, like that, there are arrangements where it might have to be ambiguous, and then you have to pay the price, which is when it gets disambiguated, it might produce paradoxical effects, like a neoliberal punk, like weird mixes, right? I think
there are examples,
Yeah, exactly.
Like I remember, I remember Siouxsie, like she was kind of.
I was trying to think of the question that you pose, Gabriel, and the difference between domain and boundaries, and I mean. There is a point of why Social Dissonance started as a art project or a concert, and it's because there is the possibility to suspend or play around with the possibility of expectations. I mean, the more that I'm thinking about it, is what I've been kind of very interested in predictive processing and the way that we kind of construct certain models and expectations of what reality is. And the aesthetic realm is a place where, you know, we can experiment with this and play and fuck around with these models and expectations. I mean, it's in a very humble way. This happens, occurs in a, in a quite, narrow type of a space. But there is the possibility to suspend, to a certain extent, certain assumptions of what things might happen. Which I don't know if yet in the political realm there is that, possibility. But maybe in CSI, that's what you were doing. You were suspending certain assumptions of what is expected from politics. But I do see that, I think if the project or the core ideas of it needs to go forward, it will need to overcome, it will need to be a bit more ambitious, I think. How to do that, that's another, it's another question which it will take quite some time, or maybe actually long, to answer and to try things, try and error. Yeah.
Dennis, I think.
Yeah, it was a great presentation, and I think it connects the question of scale to the earlier things we've been talking about when it comes to like our version of materialism and the relation between social logic and material. Because I was just thinking about the question, don't you think the reasons that the individual has, for example, to use Gabriel's example of participating in the punk movement, you have individual reasons, but then you also have the way in which punk itself as a movement reproduces itself. Yeah. Right. And there's a clear kind of shift or history there, and the way that capitalism kind of starts to shape itself to be or shapes something to reproduce certain artistic or aesthetic movements. It tries to colonize these reproductive mechanisms or whatever. Yeah. In the sense of like, you can start to own the land underneath, literally that, punk concerts, punk shows can happen, right? Like they happen on a specific place that has to be, organized and, but anyway, I'm just zooming out a bit. Like there's the reasons that the individuals have for participating, and then there is the way that the movement itself needs to find a way to reproduce itself. So what is the relationship between these two things? Is my question.
Yeah, I would say this is why social synthesis is there, because in Sohn-Rethel you have already this kind of mismatch between what you want and what you're doing in a certain sense. So of course I think Gabriel's we have to, I don't know, maybe think a little bit more about Gabriel's question in the sense of what really the normative machine is doing, because while of course there are those people who are in it for the music and they can become fascists and all of that, but at the same time you have the effect of the what I was calling an organizational practice in a certain sense, because what is interesting in punk, in hip hop, in these independent kind of music movements is the fact that you could be in it for the music and yet do some what would be deemed a certain form of political work, because you have to organize things in a community in a certain sense. even if this is not the motivator, the overt motivator. So in that sense, it's kind of similar to, real abstraction. That's because it's something that I want to do music, but in order to do music, I am kind of, I am from the worker class. I don't have a musical education. So I dare to do something. This is what I was calling kind of the imperative. Anyone can do it. But in order to do it, well, concert venues will not be accepting of what I'm doing. So I have to create my own venue, and I have to create the audience for that stuff. So in a certain sense, it has this kind of organizing effect, of course, but this also has its own limit. What I think it's interesting is that there is this mixture between also a kind of musical motivation, but arguably some people would say it is a political motivation to, somebody who doesn't have a musical education to be able to do music. But anyway, I will not delve into that, because there's always the risk of that is very, in the order of the day, of saying that everything is political. So I don't want to go there, right? Even though maybe it's warranted, the problem warranted that we go there and examine it. But anyway, that's a big question. But you have like this organizational practice nevertheless, right? So what interests me in punk is that it was in fact kind of a defiance against, the majors, the gatekeeping kind of practices of, record companies and this kind of thing. There was this kind of spreading out of venues and labels and people doing their labels. This is kind of if that is not in a certain sense like a microcosm of what we want, in a certain sense of a certain form of communist sociality, like you are able to do in your free time what, like organize a space where your leisure time is spent, and in a creative manner. So like this is, quite amazing in a certain sense. And it's made in such a way that you are not expecting, the big channels, the gatekeepers to accept you, right? You are kind of constructing the space for this to happen, which is something that I find interesting, even if the motivation might be just musical. Of course, then you have the people who shifted their politics because of that. Of course, there are a whole different set of problems. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just freestyling on that question, but yeah, I don't know. I think
just one last thing. It seems like the line is between the constructing your own space in which this social activity can take place versus using like a space that was already constructed for you. Would you say something like that?
Yeah, this is kind of, I think this is an important kind of difference that of course not only punk, but punk is a good example, it's a good symbol for that, or hip hop, or all those kind of practices that and it's kind of connected, right? It's kind of connected to their aesthetics. It's not something that there is aesthetics and I want to do music like I want to do, I don't know, conservative jazz, but I don't play well enough, so it's not really the same. There's kind of an aesthetic information there that makes it prone to have to construct its own scene in a certain sense. And the fact that this scene had this kind of a certain class character at first and was politicized, there were a lot of anarchists, a lot of people interested in that and mixed well with that. This is something that I think warrants also a certain investigation, right? It's not to say that it's the same, right? It's not to say that all those people were kind of artists that are putting art at the service of politics. They were like all of them were like Brecht. It's not really what I'm saying, right? I think it's a more complicated kind of phenomenon. I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to try to also do it in a way that I mean, so we can also bring Mattin into our most recent discussions. I just thought of trying to, because I think what Dennis said helps with this, and what you just said now, like we've been using this distinction, right, between you have something which has a logic, and you can get, like, you can decompose it into like either units or basic kind of principles of it, which allow you still to recompose that world, right? Still remain inside that space.
Yeah.
This can be like very, vulgarly, the fact that, for example, depending on which tradition you are, the way that you decompose what is meaningful parts of music go back to the rhythm, parts of melody, parts of harmony, pitches, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And there is a certain threshold, right? Below which it's not that things don't matter, right? But that they remain a black box for that world. Mm-hmm. So they matter. So you do require them to be able to complete this thing, but they are black box in the sense that if I were to take this process and try to open it up and divide it into parts, just like I did with this process on top here, I will no longer be in the world that I was. So it comes to a point in sound that if I start to decompose sound, I'm starting to use some technology that it's no longer a matter of producing audible output. I'm just analyzing a spectrum, and then I'm going to start discussing Fourier transformations and whatever. And suddenly I'm in a different language game. I'm in a different context, which is fully rational, fully decomposable, but it is below this threshold, right? And this is what we've been calling the material basis of a logic. It's a real process that the only difference from what's above the material threshold is that it is decomposable and recomposable, and the product of decomposing, recomposing remains in that world. So this is a relative boundary. Things can change, and suddenly things that were undecomposable might now be. That doesn't matter, right? It's not like an absolute thing. But it's interesting to see that from this discussion, and I think from the way, for example, that the whole thing about predictive processing and a sort of neurocognitive modeling and so on, these things come in. It's funny because if you look at a social world, right? If this is a social logic, it sounds like there is a dimension of this level of sensibility as individually concocting models of the world to lower the cognitive cost and create kind of error margin for expectations, which is below this threshold. Like there is a certain level where sensibility crosses with concepts. That is it's a black box for social world. Like if you are a cognitive zombie, a philosophical zombie or not, if you're working, if you're doing everything you need to be, in a certain sense, nobody gives a shit. Like it will keep the economy running, but it changes everything for other things, right? Where it looks like there is a certain level, but this exists. So it's not true that this is irrelevant. It's just that it is black box. When you are within the realm of what counts for social reproduction, this is a black box you cannot open. But when you are at the level of an artistic practice or an aesthetic practice, there is something about what makes a community and so on, which does matter. So if for example, the Black community in the States were not ghettified, segregated, sharing certain experiences, having access to certain things rather than others, hip hop would be totally different, and making hip hop a propagating practice would be almost impossible, right? So it does contribute, but it is black box, because when it gets to the experience of community, it's not like hip hop invented a new form of social exchange. It didn't. So you get like, great rap artists rapping about making money, like Jay-Z. Like, how can it be that when you try to like go into this and come out with something, you come up with, black money? Because this is black boxed in a way. You can't open unless you change the discourse. And a lot of artists, hip hop artists do. They kind of create a separate life while they do something else, which is like activism. And then they need to deal with the fact that there is like a inversion, right? So I wonder if, if you take, and this is the difference between boundary and domain that we were talking about. This material level, this constraint here that we're talking about, it is a domain constraint. It says, if you want to include this process into your logical description, you're going to go into a parallax. When you make this rational, this becomes indifferent, and vice versa. And a boundary constraint is here. It's asking questions of the sort, how can you decompose and recompose what matters in ways that you can expand its reach, right?
Yeah.
So this is where the problem of synthesis lives. And this here is where the problem of boundary, as you said. And this here is where the problem of domain lives. And the problem of material basis, which is coming up all the time in this conversation, right? And they are related, but they point in slightly different. I think it helps to show that they are like orthogonal axes, They have different trade-offs, I think. So I wonder if this helps to kind of
I think
pose the two things,
Yeah, I think it helps a lot. Yeah, thank you.
And then just to conclude, what I would say is that this makes a difference clear between social dissonance and CSII, because the things that were outside of the circle could have been in. We could have decomposed our practice to include the fact that some people are economically cannot join, inhibit, like the things that we couldn't integrate. They were part of the same world, because the political world and the social world is made of the same thing, right? So I'd say that it's the way social synthesis and boundaries appear in that context is different than the way that like the sensible and the social are clashing, and you're exploiting the fringe between those two, in the very expression social dissonance, I think.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
Go on, Mattin.
I think we need to go back and have a clear definition of what social synthesis is. Because, I mean, it seems to me that you sometimes give it like positive qualities, or you talk about the social synthesis of punk. But the way that I understand it, according to Sohn-Rethel, that is the way that it generates, through living under, capitalist relationships, it generates a kind of form of social glue that things make sense together.
Yeah.
So I see it as a kind of form of sociality. In fact, I'm dealing with notions of ideology, so I'm interested in seeing how they relate. Like I'm trying to counter in a question that I got is like, into what extent differs social dissonance to the concepts of ideology and hegemony? And I'm trying to think through, okay, in relationship to also social synthesis, as that glue that holds things, together in capitalist society. And then this idea of the model, from predictive processing. But I see it as, I see it social synthesis as a kind of that, so one cannot give it a positive balance under these conditions. You cannot. I don't think the way that I understood it. Maybe I'm wrong, and you have to correct me. But I don't think that you can have a positive understanding of social synthesis independent of the broader social synthesis. They are connected and they are, intricated, and there is no, it's I would say that there is a more determining kind of form of social synthesis that the punk social synthesis could be part of it. Like you could not make like an autonomous form of social synthesis.
Yeah, I agree with that. This is why I was saying that my criticism of punk, for instance, at some point was that it was parasitic. But I think any kind of sociality that you come up with within capitalism, it's up to a point parasitic, up to a point, right? Up to a point. There's kind of relative autonomy. You could come up with solutions, but they are kind of relatively parasitic in a certain sense, at least for us, urban dwellers that are interested in politics and all that. Anyway, but I agree with that. But I don't think that social synthesis is by itself negative or positive. I think social synthesis is a neutral concept that is a kind of descriptive concept for Sohn-Rethel. This is why he mentions, and I mentioned in the final version, that he talks, he's very kind of thin, his distinctions. I think social synthesis is an interesting thing that you could expand and come up with. I think STP does this in a certain way, but he's very thin in his kind of taxonomy. He has like two kinds of societies of appropriation, societies of production. It's very thin in Sohn-Rethel, but I think the concept has a potentiality to go beyond that. But in Sohn-Rethel himself, the idea of society of production, for instance, is not a negative idea. It's a kind of social synthesis that is kind of for that kind of social synthesis. In fact, he even thinks that, for instance, Taylorism and Fordism kind of are pathways into a more communitarian planning of production in a certain sense. So this is kind of the very polemical part 3 of the book. So I don't think it is a kind of a concept, an evil concept in a certain sense. I just think it's a kind of a descriptive concept. And there's a particular social synthesis, which is the social synthesis of exchange abstraction, that give rise to the abstraction of value and everything we have in capitalist society. So when I ask about what is the social synthetic functions of such and such and such practice, I'm asking in a certain way about what are the potentialities of those practices to beget a certain set of social nexuses, in a certain sense. Of course, these social nexuses, of course, will be part of, if we are in a city like Rio de Janeiro, it will be part of the capitalist society, of course, capitalist whole, capitalist totality, of course. But nevertheless, you could have like a certain difference between the internal rule of that sociality and the outside rule, even if that thing is sustained through in the last instance within the capitalist sociality, right? For instance, an example, we had like a debate. Gabriel was part of this collective as well. We had this space here in Rio, Fosso. There was at some point a debate with one of our members, our friends that he wanted no truck with paper money. We wouldn't use money if I remember correctly. I think the argument was that, which was a kind of prefigurative politics in a certain sense. No, nobody will be paid because what we are doing here has nothing to do with money, right? So he was trying to institute a kind of limit. Don't know if it's really a boundary, but it's a limit between the dealings that were going on in the events, in what we were organizing within Fosso, and the stuff that is outside. Of course, you go out of the door, you will have to take a bus, and you have to pay your ticket and all that. So this was the debate, and me and Gabriel, for instance, we were on the side of no. We have to take into account that people will go out of the door and pay for a ticket to get to the bus. So there was kind of this debate, which is a kind of interesting debate regarding your question, like, are we, and regarding what Gabriel also said, like the material basis in a certain sense, are we taking into account that actually, even if we try to enact this anarchist community here with no money, actually people, in order for people to get here, they will have to spend money? Are we taking that into account or not? Will that be part of the world in the sense of being a criterion of organization of what we are doing here, or it won't? Of course, we won because we thought, well, there are actually people from different kind of social strata that come here, and we have to take that into account. I can't really invite a friend of ours that lives in Belfort Roxo to come here and work like for free for us. I don't think this is tenable. And this would be tenable if conditions of entrance were equal, but the conditions of entering the space are not equal. So these are kind of connects to this problem in a certain sense. So, of course, it is a parasitic activity. We had to take into account the fact that everybody spent money to get there. So we took the measure of, dividing equally all the amount of money from tickets sold in our events without distinction between manual and intellectual labor, which means artistic labor and people who were at the bar selling booze and the people who were cleaning. Everybody got the same in some sense. And there was, of course, a certain amount that was going to pay for the rent of the house. So this was kind of the solution, of course, and it's a less radical solution in the sense of drawing a boundary, but in a certain sense, it had to take into account a certain determination that comes from outside the house, let us say, right? So it's a kind of debate that has to do with that problem in a certain sense, right? So we accepted the capitalist social synthesis, but we tried to attenuate it within the space instead of negating it at the price of accentuating it because people had to come in the door. And if we don't take that into the differences of income that were being spent just getting there, we would be accentuating this. So this is the rationale behind it. I lost how it connects what you say. Maybe I'm tired, but I hope this is helpful.
Yeah, can I just say one more thing on this? Because I also have to go, but I feel like the reason we want to modify Sohn-Rethel seems to me that the social synthesis, as he defines it, it doesn't give you a lot of tools to distinguish between novel political experiments and those things which are just always already like attached to the social synthesis, because there's only one thing, which is the capitalist one. And in a lot of senses, like there's a political upshot to all this, which is that you can always say any movement is just a like vehicle for capitalist expansion, like punk, for example, hip hop.
Yeah.
If you zoom out a little bit and you can always take a cynical stance. And I think earlier someone mentioned like Adam Curtis, who I think is like does this a lot, which is you look at a movement and you say, you see, in the end, this movement was just a way to kind of give an outlet for discontent. Like punk is just a way for the alienated youth to expend some of their, discontent on the way to their, becoming bourgeois subjects or whatever. Like that, and even within the punk scene, that's kind of a position, or any kind of movement. You have people within the movement that say, "Oh, it used to be pure when it first started, then it became this kind of corrupted thing." So if all you have is social synthesis, like writ large, this totalizing thing, then everything looks like it gets absorbed in the end.
Yeah,
exactly.
Sorry. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I couldn't agree more. I do think that there's some truth in saying like things got integrated, and everything was just a way to become bourgeois and everything like that. But this is kind of an external point of view of the regarding the the internal unfolding of what was happening. In a certain sense, it's interesting, and I think we do this a lot, and maybe the Badiou influence is important there, the Lazarus also, that is to uphold the reality of the experience of being there in the movement, beyond the failures or integrations and everything that comes after. I think this is a really important point. And also the social synthesis point is that I take, so of course, I take your point, Dennis. I think both you and Mattin, I think there's reason for thinking that, oh, if you use the concept of social synthesis, you will end up upholding just the most general social synthesis, which is capitalist social synthesis and all that. But I take us as doing exactly that, as pluralizing the kinds of social synthesis through the modes, mode A, mode B, mode C, and what have you. I think what is interesting in social synthesis is exactly that, is the fact that there is something coming together, and these things might, of course, be part of the capitalist fabric, but they might as well have a kind of autonomous, relative autonomy. And this weaves into exactly your point about the interiority of those movements. And then it makes sense to ask, what is the social synthetic functions within the movement, and from the movement to the beyond of the movement, right? Which is actually what I think we are doing, what I think Henzo was doing in his presentation on the boundaries and things like that, and the school occupations and things like that. So at least the way I take social synthesis to operate, I think it's a concept that may be may be multiscalar. You could have like a different social synthesis operating in different levels. I think we do exactly that with the monster, A, B, and C, the mixtures and all that in a certain sense. So this is why I don't take social synthesis to be like a bad guy in itself, right? Maybe the term has baggage because of Sohn-Rethel and the way he employs it. As I said, I think in Sohn-Rethel, it is really thin. The kind of variations that he can come up with are really few, like 2. If I remember correctly, there are 2. So, yeah, this was my take on that. But many thanks, Dennis. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree with this term, plural synthesis or plural social synthesis. I think that's exactly what we're doing.
Also, this leads me to one thing you said, like about fine-tuning the diagrams and so on. I had a question regarding this because I'm not sure how it reflects on just the notation or how much it has like a deeper conceptual point. Because I think that this is like, I can see how it would change the representation of the circle's work, but I don't know how it would affect social dissonance. But I think that it would clarify the thing that you're commenting on, because correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps it would even be good for you to make clearer to me. Perhaps I didn't understand it, but like this is how you drew the expanded diagram, right? You have like an individual agent here. You wrote here a political organization, and the circle would be here.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, the arrows go many ways, but I'm just going to choose one way so we can track like commutation. Like somehow CSII is part of the political world. Individuals are part of CSII, but the way that they belong to the political world wouldn't be the world here. It's not the same as the way they belong, right? And then you said, well, but we want to expand this to look at this and this, which would be a different political world, and then this here commutes, right? I'm just gonna add like a little star here and here to say that there is some difference, right, between these two. Is this correct, like this understanding?
Yeah, if I remember correct, I didn't say political world. I said political organizations, which is part of the political world at large.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think this might make a difference, right?
Okay.
Because see, what I think, of course, this is my understanding of CSII and all that. But the way I understood what was happening is that the CSII was instrumental, very important at a point that at a moment where leftist identity was demanded in a certain sense. You have to be a leftist and all that. So you have this space that suspended the demand for a leftist identity, even if this space was composed of mostly people who are interested in the left, the majority at least, and a majority of militants of some kind of organization. So the way I understand is that there is a kind of a mediation, there is kind of a political organization, a relationship between individual agent and political organizations that is a kind of an identitarian demand, or as you said in your text, an ideal, right? Whereas the participation in the circle did something different from what is the direct relationship between these individual agents and their political affiliations, the organizations to which they are affiliated. So in a certain sense, this modified the relationship between them and the organization, put a second kind of level, a second degree. They can see that they have a relationship to the organization at a distance from the relation itself.
Mhm.
And in a certain sense, this created this minimal distance where I think I mentioned the text is kind of changed the superegoic dimension of being part of a political organization.
Yeah. So, but the thing that I think it's interesting, and that's what I wanted to understand. Like, given this, like, okay, of course, this here is just these arrows here were of a different color, just to highlight that there is a transformation from 1 to 4. So, but it's what I found interesting is that because originally we had this very simpler, like the original diagram was we have an individual, you have the social world, and we would say if the way an individual belongs to the social world is the same as the way it belongs to a mediation that belongs to the social world, that mediation is just a social mediation. It's a social institution. Like citizens belong to the world, and the way that citizens are seen by the police is very much in line with how they are seen by the world. So the police is not a political mediation in the kind of transformative sense. Police is, on the contrary, a very socially stable, conservative, even reactionary mediation. And then the question is, okay, but let's say that, as the arrows here you used, let's say that taking the upper path is different from the lower path, right? And then you need to justify where is the difference coming from. In the original text, we introduce something on top, right? Which would be, let's say, the political movement. And this is constraining the mediation. And we're saying, well, it's because this mediation is not only constrained by the world, it's constrained by the political movement as well. This is making so that the commitments you need to have to be part of this mediation are different than the commitments you need to have to be part of the social world. So that would be where the difference comes from, right? And then we expanded this in the following way.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I'm just going to add this here, like with these arrows here, because they're not made not of the same way.
The world and transform the individual. Yeah.
So you see, like, it's interesting because this diagram here, it's actually inside of this without these upper arrows.
This was on purpose, right? Like it's kind of, you apply the logic, you have to have like the arrow that commutes, and it's kind of the same.
Yeah, because I mean, this is exactly where the difference would appear. If you had added the fact that the circle was part of a party, and when the party was removed, we had like 5 different political organizations feeding onto the circle, right?
Okay, yeah.
The fact that that social dissonance can be a mediation, I mean, that is, this is where the social synthesis arrow appears. Like, I know you're creating a dissonance within a social sensibility, but is this being constrained by something that is bigger, right? I think that's the way you've been framing questions to Mattin about how this is framed into something bigger that is not exactly the social world, but this is committed to, right? I think that
the art world,
this arrow here clarifies it a bit, because the conditions of possibility of revolutionary artistic practices are very mixed between the political commitments and also the conditions of the art world, which are permissive for other reasons, right? So they don't propagate. And then I think that it's interesting because the moment that this arrow is not placed, this arrow here it needs to do all the work. And this is where social dissonance is a sensibility issue, the transformation of one individual into another, right? So the curious thing about the complete diagram is that it is saying something like, you as an individual, like this individual, just not to ruin it completely, like this individual, it's part of this world. but it can be part of mediations whose normative principles actually are constrained by something which is not that world. It's, let's say, the history of the communist movement. And then I ask you, why do you behave like this in this space? And you will have to bring this into play to explain. You cannot make rational without adding that, because if you don't agree that those justifications are rational justifications, that behavior will be unjustified, right? And then the issue is that, well, but if you now want to perceive that individual as a rational individual, you need to see them as a different individual, because, right, this little triangle doesn't close. Like, so if I just take you to be part of the social world, and I ask you, why are you part of the political party? I won't understand. I need to conceive of you as somebody torn between the world, right, and the political movement you're part of. And then I understand your justification, right? Even more, if I want to now see that torn individual as your strong foothold, like the rational side is your communist side, and the exceptional but not really, you can't erase it, it's there, but it's not really the core part. I need to postulate another world which is actually commensurate with that behavior, and not the current world, which is a sick thing out there, which makes the unessential part kind of the most relevant one, right? So I have the impression that there is something very, like, there is when you see this diagram here, the two things become clear. Like the core of the circle was this arrow, and the therapeutic side was this transformation, right? We have very little effectivity here, though these days I find it very, I think it's a good question. You can find like hundreds of people in, like, I don't know, more than 1,000 kilometers. Like, there are people in Amazonas who were from the circle and who still do things with regards to it. I never imagined that, but it happened. But regardless, like, the fact that we were saying you can have a mediation that is constrained by a very complex and conflictual political world, and it won't crumble if you accept being seen and experience yourself as an individual which is torn in a different way, right? So these arrows here, they all kind of come into play, and I feel like this would clarify where perhaps, you know, it's not a, I don't even think you should think of it as a limit, but just a difference of practices, which I would say would start probably on the other side. Like, you would start from the opposite. Like, we're not capable yet of constructing this because we're stuck, unable to do this. So, like, it's almost like CSII starts here. How do you write CSII? And social distance starts here, right? You can educate your senses to bear more negativity. That would make it easier to connect you to this machine. But then you need something on the other side.
Yeah, that's pretty good, yeah.
Like, I think that it's already totally compatible with what you did, because it's just not, the arrows are not there, but it could definitely be, and perhaps it would take it even further, like, because this diagram here is here, right? It's this.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it was on purpose.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, like, how much these three arrows help with clarifying the social synthesis discussion, right?
Yeah, the problem is that it wasn't clear for me what was playing the role of the PM, the political movement. In the CSII, of course, it's clear enough. In social dissonance, it's not. So it might be the same. So if it's the same, it doesn't clarify much. But I do like your point that social dissonance starts from the relationship between individual and individual plus, or individual, two, or whatever, and that CSII starts from the belonging to the political movement in a certain sense. But then I still wanted to make a difference between the CSII and normal political organization, you see, because it's quite different to be part of, I don't know, PCO and CSII, right? So
but for example, in that sense, these days, just a hypothesis, the way that I would do is that I would take this thing here, I would zoom it out,
Mm-hmm.
And what you probably see is that what we call a political movement in Brazil in the 2010s is like you have a bunch of totally incompatible political principles from a very fragmented scenario, and they say that you can only follow them if you deal with a certain content in a certain way. And we tried at least to create a mediation that was going to say, yeah, but there's still a common element to all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds meta-political, and you can even say it does, because it does have a petition of principle about these forms abide to all your different principles. But it's still below all of this. These things are, without these things, it wouldn't have any purpose. Like, right? It wouldn't exist if there weren't conflicting political principles that had to be worked through, right? So it is kind of inside. I would say it's a matter of asking, which then clarifies the continuity between the circle and STP. What are the conditions for this arrow to be possible? Like, is it possible to reconnect, local organizations back to a large political ecology in a non-naive way, right? Mm-hmm. I think that was an experiment in this. Like, it still requires the arrows to come in and out from the social world. It still was constrained by these upper things. If you remove them, I agree, it becomes static. But there was never a moment in the circle where we weren't connected to these arrows, right? So upper arrows coming from a political movement. So I don't know. I think that there is a big drama and a big kind of defeat and saturation and things to be discussed, but I think they really have a lot to do with this arrow, and perhaps with limits of this. Like, how much could we actually inform the people in the activities that we did of the value of this, and see yourself politically as something valuable because you're part of solving this issue, right? Because it doesn't require people to bear a lot of dissonance. And I think that there is something about this arrow here and this transformation, which we didn't have the means to, not even conceptually experiment, but like practically, sensibly experiment with. Whereas it sounds like social dissonance had this part much clearer in view, and you can even name this difference here as a dissonance, the social part of the dissonance coming from here and here, a smaller world where some things you cannot let go of, right? And a bigger world where the subject kind of can surpass their own kind of disruption, right? So it looks like this part is clearer, and you're asking the question, okay, but this can only be maintained and propagated and be consistent beyond a certain limited experience if you can also account for these larger errors, right? So there is like it becomes more clearly complementary in a way than analogous, right? It would almost like we should have, like in the CSSI, we should have like constant communist social dissonance training. And I perhaps you would even explain why you thought of creating. Remember, there was a time where you thought of creating a subset for free improvisation.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's almost like the social dissonance subset.
Yeah, the social dissonance subset was almost created.
Yeah, it was always created. Yeah.
So perhaps it clarifies in which sense this is a puzzle, and not so much just an analogy reaching common limit. I don't know.
Yeah. That was really helpful. I really appreciate it, and I see that. But I basically think that any form of political organization will have to deal with social dissonance in the sense that either they have or proposing some kind of idea of the subject, either like if they're in the social democratic kind of realm, they will fall into the kind of the social dissonance that I'm describing quite clearly in the book. But any other, I think the problem is of proposing a different type of social relations while being in this world, so inevitably there is going to be a huge distance between the claims that one is doing and uh, and and being heated by reality. And the problem is that no political organization, as far as I know, is able to give a space for this social dissonance to be explored, because it will actually mean to maybe undermine some of its foundational ideas, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and this I was comparing to. I think CSII is the political organization that I know that gave space to social dissonance. This is what I.
But you know,
justifies why I was comparing, right?
yeah. But you know, this is something I changed my mind in time. I would even call it a humbling process, because I was very much of a similar position, and I felt for a while that there was a kind of capacity for bearing this disjunction between what you're thinking and what we're doing, that being at that point, kind of inhabiting that division, was very crucial. And it was it took me a while to realize, like, the exact question, like, are there organizations that can do this? I think there are. I think most organizations are like that. The issue is rather, can you recuperate something from that? Or can you, like, the cost of doing that, it can only be done in between the lines through very weird procedures. Like, can we get better procedures for, let's say, recuperating what happens, you know, behind our backs? Because I think it's a slightly more humble, but also a more generous position. And it also clarifies the role of a lot of Marxist concepts, like, not concepts, but like narratives, and like the very vulgar aesthetics of communist politics, which is all about telling yourself stories that have no bearing on reality, about what Trotsky and Stalin did, what happened in Kronstadt, about which flag you have at home, like, people are not stupid. Like, they're not just trapped in a deadlock. The issue is that for most of the time, the ways in which we can recuperate things after a political struggle, because politics is so costly, like, at the individual, social level. I mean, this is a big difference. The fact that, like, to try something political, first, it never means trying only with yourself. It means trying something with other people. So the risk is always higher. And it always takes, let's say, a level of kind of risk at the level of your social reproduction conditions, which is very risky in itself. So to make a mistake, for things to go wrong, for you to have to recuperate some information from those mistakes, is very, very costly. And I think that there is something to like, there's a slight shift that I at least currently, I feel like it's worth doing, from the more strict claim that this is never done, that this social dissonance is never productively explored, to the fact that it's explored through so many roundabouts, so that it can finally appear 30 years later from the mouth of a crazy theoretician, that perhaps that underlying current was actually the crucial thing, and then it becomes a crucial thing. But it takes, like, you know, there's definitely shorter paths, if almost like the perceptive architecture of people were a bit more malleable, perhaps, right? So I do think that there is something about, let's say, there is, I see a lot of value in the idea that there's something like an educational dimension of aesthetics to be fulfilled. But I think we don't need the idea that organizations don't do this to justify it, you know? They do this because leftists clearly live in constant dissonance between what they need to do to pay their bills and what they discuss in that little bit of the time of their lives where they're in a meeting discussing, you know, what is the right position on Kronstadt or something.
No, but or I guess maybe you said it, but I think, you know, it gets manifested in ultra nasty. It can get manifested in ultra nasty ways of personifications and, like, kind of problems and all this, you know, and yeah, and it can get super nasty. And I don't think there are, you know, as far as I know, there are no very good techniques or, you know, ways of actually going about them. You know, it's often happens in, you know, and, you know, even, you know, the more you go, you know, just the more personifying, the more you go to the left, the more personifying, and, you know, like the personal and the political becomes like, I don't know, like just huge kind of, I mean, it can be absolutely brutal, you know.
Yeah, yeah, no,
And
definitely.
I think there is no, yeah, there's no that's necessary distance or like kind of yeah, like or techniques or series of techniques, or, you know, it's like people, we just have to learn the hard way, as it was the only way, you know. And it's you know, but I'm you know, I mean, yeah, so it's very interesting that you deal with it as a kind of core element of the CSI practice. But I don't know many other, you know, they it happens, but in a very often personal and nasty kind of way, I think.
Menos eu acho.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. I mean, I lost the bulk of the discussion, unfortunately, but yeah, I listened to the last 15 minutes, but I wanted to see how this relates, because to see if I understood it, and because Caron used the boundary discussion that Victor and I presented. And to me, it was very interesting because it was, I think, the original motivation to me to come up with this distinction was I had CSII, and which was an experience I didn't participate on, and the way it contrasted with the kind of sort of political practice I participated on, and they seem to sort of like do this sort of figure ground, you know, like bistable imagery, where you can you either see one but you don't see the other, and they somehow were complementary, and I think it was related to the fact of one thinking the boundary and the other thinking of the interior. That's the way I sort of like solve this riddle to me. So I wanted to see how you think this embeds to the.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah, let me just share the. I made a small diagram. To. Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
So if you guys remember, like from the original presentation, you had this sort of model in which you divide the political body, which would be I guess the political movement in the original diagram, you split it into an interior and the boundary, and you can still sort of like think about where the individual and the mediations go to. They can be displaced to the interior or to the boundary, but in any case, the move was to sort of split into an interior, which is somewhere you cannot access the world directly, and the boundary, which is somewhere you can always sort of like get a part of the world and a part of the interior. So that's just to contextualize for people who hadn't seen this before. And I was thinking of the discussions from Gabriel's last presentation, in which you got to abstract some arrows, right, to locate where the distinction between system and world comes up, depending on which arrows you concentrate yourself on. And I think it's to me, like CSII, it sort of like seems to abstract this arrow that goes from the boundary to the world. So it senses, it sort of like abstracts out like the kind of strategic goal the organizations have, right? In order for you to make intelligible the common stuff that we all sort of share when we organize, right? So it's able to sense the world. I agree with that. Like there's still a reference out there that is sort of like absorbed, but it's worked out from the way it appears in the inside, right? So if you remove this, if you bracket the world, you're sort of like, you're able to the sort of like the arrows, the system versus the environment would be these two arrows. Maybe I should have used like some special color. While in my experience, my political practice, the sort of like the annoying symptomatic part was that people were very concentrated on like the capacity of a group to sort of like produce effects and sense new sort of like social. It was like this investigative practice, but it seemed that in order to do that, they sort of like left out the sort of like determinations that come from the internal organizations. They get sort of like bracketed out or left unthinked, and such that the sort of like the thinking is way more the sort of like intercourse between the group and the sort of like it's sensing and acting to the world. So yeah, I just wanted to see if you think it's compatible with, and that's why how I like, to me it made so much sense like what you wrote, because it fits this image that I also sort of had. And then I think the presentation with me and Victor was about creating that, again, the sort of like dual picture that is the militant and the worker at the level of the individual, but that is this sort of like dialectics between the interior and the boundary. So that's where I would distinguish the two kinds of political sort of like idealized versions of practice. But and I don't know how it will relate to aesthetics. Like I feel this leads to different aesthetics, like this kinds of like this kind of groups. I think that, I don't know, they aestheticize some sort of like interior mystical experience that gets displayed not to the interior, but like to some sort of like event, some horizon, some like revolutionary thing. But I don't know. Yeah, I think it has to be worked out, but I think it leads to different aesthetics probably. But yeah, just.
I think this is incredible, and I do think that social dissonance is similar to CSII by your standards, by these standards. If we take social dissonance to be an enclosed space, and in my paper, maybe that wasn't clear enough. I'm already saying, I'll tell this to Mattin right away. Perhaps I should rewrite a little bit, give me a little bit of time just to rewrite something after this, but a little bit, just the session on the CSII. But I think that if we consider social dissonance the way Mattin does it, as an enclosed space, because it seems that we need an enclosed space for it to happen. You need some kind of reversal between rules, or a reversal of normative commitments between those who are inside and those who are outside. Outside, you are working, you are a regular person, so you have a lot of commonalities between the enclosed space produced by social dissonance and the political space in the way we, and you particularly, Renzo, but we in the STP are thinking about. And so there are a lot of, I think, commonalities. But it is within these commonalities, the fact that you have an enclosure in a certain sense, therefore a boundary in a certain sense, and a mediation between interior and exterior, there is, within this commonality, it is even more analogous to the CSII. This, you are capturing basically the rationale behind my paper. It was basically that. This is why I brought in the CSII, because I thought that was a good example. I am convinced by what Gabriel showed, but this also expresses well why I did it the way I did. You see, because I thought there was this figure ground relationship where for the CSII it was not about changing the world; it was about changing the militant world in a certain sense. And changing the militant world entailed looking at the militants and looking at militant activity from a point of view at distance of itself in a certain sense. And I mentioned PCO, which was of course a joke, but because PCO is kind of the most kind of, I don't know, super egoic kind of organization there is, like, and all of these kind of all these dynamics that gets into doing militant work that has to do with this socially dissonant kind of Of course, Gabriel is right. Any political organization has to do that, but it is different if you do it because you have to do that, and you do it as the material of your practice. And then I think the CSII was different in that regard, and I agree with that with what you are presenting. And this gives credence to my comparison with Social Dissonance, which is not a political movement, but it was an aesthetic practice that dealt in an enclosed space which had a political motivation. So, right, like there are differences, but there's a lot in common for me.
Yeah, the thing that I would just ask Renzo also about, which I can see this, it makes sense to me, though what you mean by the little arrow that is broken, I think it's a bit unclear, because, for example, neither Grupão or CSII could exist if some things that they didn't focus on didn't exist. So if there wasn't spontaneously forming, deforming, transforming interior, Treta couldn't exist. But how that cost was featured and thought about perhaps was, secondary to the action, the conflict, the struggle. Whereas in the circle, it would be impossible for it to exist if people weren't doing things political, like just a group. If we just had a room where people came in, they wrote work notes and said, like, okay, what's going to happen now? That machine wouldn't kickstart, bootstrap itself, because it's not for nothing that it was born inside a political party, that it was dissolved when we felt like something wasn't no longer happening. Like just the bootstrapping itself, there wouldn't be any reason to end. But it's true that thing on which it relied wasn't featured as, let's say, part of the strategic picture, right? It was meant to solve itself, to the point that we have members from PCO. You guys mentioned it, but we had a senator from the Causa Operária in the circle, right? So I think that there are three different things. Like there is a type of interdependence between organizations that goes kind of unthematized. Like you depend on the propagation of certain things to be able to have the stuff that you use and you treat, but that propagation is not part of the logic of that space. So it is a kind of forgetting or abstraction as you propose here, but it's specific, right? It is crossing a boundary. Like the other organizations deal with this, we don't, right? Like it's not like, for example, it's part of the strategy to say, of a group of action, to say there shouldn't be any spaces on the left where people are, worried about, what happens inside an organization. It's just that we don't do this here. So you can specialize, right? Because of interdependence. And of course, it can bite you in the ass if that specialization is poorly conceived. It's not really effective, right? But it's different from something being totally removed from purview, in the sense that it's broken and you don't use it and you let go of it completely. It's not even dependent on it, which is still different from a third thing, which is that phenomenon is not even in your domain. Like in the sense that even if you do rely on it, you could never translate it into something. So for example, in an exaggerated sense, you rely on the laws of physics, but you can't translate them back into politics. Like they're there in the background, they're from a different domain, right? So I think that distinction, the distinction between these levels could be useful. And also, if you want to see where it goes to a very core concept, is the idea of experimentation, because experiments, they are enclosed spaces up to a point. Like they need to preserve inside the thing about the outside that you're intervening on and you want to know more about. So you do want to remove interference, but you don't want to remove everything, right? Which is why I also think that, this is not like a retrospective invention. This was already at stake. Even in the text that Caron used, the free thought from thinkers, it ends on this point. Part of creating an enclosed space is about bringing to the fore how militants are part of the social world, right? Dealing with issues that usually disappear. Like if you're constantly acting, you always have a means to separate yourself from workers or for people who don't do anything. if you're not acting, the fact that militants and workers are more entangled as positions might be clearer. So it's not only that you find out something about yourself in the sense of what you did that you didn't know you were doing. It's what seeps into that space is hopefully something about the social world at large, right? If you fail, if you're too strict in artificializing, that transitivity won't exist. And what happens inside that space has only to do with that space. It doesn't give you a better picture of something bigger, right? And if you're too loose, there is no boundary and you won't be able to remove interferences. So, but it is like the concept of experiment is somehow trapped between the domain threshold, which is very absolute, and the interdependency that you're not thinking about, which is very, very, very weak. Like somewhere between these things, you want to create a boundary that removes interference, but allows real stuff to appear, right? At least, I mean, within the rationale of the circle. So, which I don't think is generalizable, but yeah, those things, I don't know how to navigate those differences. I think they're quite relevant to this discussion, like it's a bit. I see the two drawings here at the bottom, the two diagrams. It sounds to me the difference between like experimentation and like engineering or technological stuff. Like in the small group, you kind of have the ropes. You don't need to find out what matters and what doesn't, and you're constructing something. And in the first, you don't know what matters and what doesn't. So
yeah,
like it's something like this.
Yeah. I think I tried calling it experimentation and investigation.
Yeah, I remember now. Yeah.
And I think it's related because I'm not saying that this disconnection is real. Like it's a disconnection in the sense of you're sort of like optimizing your sort of machinery to sort of like sense this inner loop, and you sort of like become more insensible to like what kinds of outer effects. Like again, as you said, like you did produce effects to the outside, but it seems that the sort of like the machinery was optimized to sort of like capture what appeared inside. So it was porous and it did produce effects, but maybe they weren't sort of like, things were not strategically sort of like crafted to produce effects in the outside, right? So I would say it's like, it's not about like a real broken link in both cases. I think it's not like in the other cases, it's not that there's no internal determination, it's the opposite, right? There's determination without people being able to sort of like grasp it, because it's all like a consequence of, everything is read in terms of sort of like historical or like at the level of some sort of like structural determination. It's nothing is sort of like like of the specific organizational choice, because everything is sort of like optimized to sense sort of like the
but
world.
The thing that now I think it brings because this is the source of why very early on in the circle, this was let's say the only Lacanian insight and kind of Hegelian insight that was really, really at the core of this. Because if we now add the new idea of like, okay, there is something that is this, which is the environment, right? And it's here as well. The crazy thing a crazy Hegelian hypothesis is that if you want to know about the world, which is not the environment, you need to look in, not here, right? This is the crazy thing about physics. Like, you don't investigate to learn about the laws of nature. You do experiments, because the material basis of the inside is the material basis of the world. Whereas if you look at this, if you look outside, you see the environment. You don't see the world, like the transcendental level, right? So like investigations, they are outward looking, but the world as it is outwardly constituted is called environment. It's the world you can touch, right? The Lacanian Hegelian insight is that the inside of the inside is more outside than the outside, right? So if a social constraint emerges from within an organization, it is a pure transcendental constraint than the constraint that you engage on the outside. because from the outside you get from your environment, and from the inside you get from the material basis of the. Fuck, sorry, let me erase it. Yeah, I don't know how to erase it. Here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree.
I'm not sure if
But-
this makes sense. I'm just saying that this was somehow
Yeah.
thought about somewhere.
But I think, because I agree with everything, but I still think that there is a like a sort of like dual set of like practice, which is like I was calling investigation, which seems to do something a bit different and still produces some sort of knowledge. And I think that, like, as you said, like the experimental side is about sort of like creating this sort of artificial boundary in which you can actually produce new sort of like relations, and you sort of, in the same way that an experiment creates the phenomena in this sort of like ideal setting. So you're able to sort of like get the logical sort of isolated sort of like an experiment with new forms. But I think that the dual to that, and what I traced about the investigation, was about being able to collect. You sort of have to already know what you're looking for, right? Because what you're made out determines what you're able to sense. So in that sense, it's already preformed, but you are still able to get new parts of the world and make out, like in this engineered sort of dimension you said, right? You can go out and like interact with new stuff and make it into, and put it into your insight, like get new sort of social actors that you didn't know could be part of you, to interact with them, and then they become in this sort of like tension of coming to your side, to the interior, and becoming a new part which can sense new stuff inside. So this increasing heterogeneity, which is a function of what you can sense inside, it's, I think, a function of a kind of practice that is sort of like concerned with this sort of like investigatory or engineering side.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I didn't say this to the. I think that there is, like, this is where the Lacanian stuff is limited. Like, I don't think it's a point in its favor. It's just that it's curious to see that, like, when you add that frontier, you see why experiments are done in controlled conditions in a lab. You know, like, the world is infinite, and you take like the finest chunk of it to experiment on. Like, why?
Yeah.
Because moving outward, you move to the environment, and then you have like infinite stuff to do, but it's slightly different what happens than this other thing. Of course, you want to get it all. You don't want to get just a bit of it, right? But that clarified for me a bit. It's like a nice, perhaps the trade-off is interesting of, you can know about the laws if you're not changing them. That's experiments. And you can change the laws if you're not really in a position to know them in a pure form. And then that's investigating, something like that.
Yeah, because it seems that the universal content of, say, communism or like laws of physics comes when you're able to produce relations inside, right? So it's sort of like, while what you get from this other kind of practice is not exactly universality, but it's like a new like you get new compositions. I don't know what's, yeah.
Guys, I need to cook. Even Monica left.
I just realized there's only the two.
Yeah, no.
Even Mattin left.
Sorry.
No,
It was too much
Mattin-
social
yeah.
dissonance for Mattin.
No, he sent me an email. He was very, gracious about it and thanked, and he was, very tired, and the computer was, whatever. So then I'll ask him if he wants to present, sometime soon. We'll see. Yeah, this is great. Thank you
It was really cool.
for your suggestions and criticisms, and yeah, maybe this will entail some modifications in what I did, but yeah. Thanks.
A gente tá falando inglês, não sei porquê, gente. Tchau.
Caralho, pois é,
Não tem nem, só tem nós três. A Mônica acabou de sair. Eu vou lá que eu tenho que. Eu subo a
Tá bom.
gravação amanhã de manhã.
Valeu. Até já.
Ah,
Até,
gente.
gente. Tchau, tchau.